The United Kingdom has an epic history and a wealth of secrets still to uncover. Every year, hundreds of archaeologists dig, dive, and sieve to find clues, to add to the great historical jigsaw of our ancestors' lives.
You know when people say, what's the best thing you've ever found, guys? This.
I'm Professor Alice Roberts. This year we've uncovered some astonishing finds and made some truly groundbreaking discoveries.
Wow, look at that.
Each team of archaeologists has been armed with a dig diary camera so they can record their discoveries as they happen.
That is brilliant. Dave, I love you.
Our roving archaeologist, Dr. Nisha McSweeney, is out on the digs.
Who are we looking at?
It's royal.
And I'll be inviting the teams to bring in their finds for closer analysis.
That is absolutely beautiful.
In this special edition of Digging for Britain, we're exploring the archaeology of World War II. We're joining digs from across the country to give us an insight into the lives of those who lived and fought during the war, from the physical evidence they left behind. We'll witness the raising of a World War II bomber from the depths of the English Channel, the unearthing of one of Hitler's feared V2 rockets, and an excavation of a hostel where young Holocaust survivors were brought after the war. Welcome to Digging for Britain. I've come to the Imperial War Museum in Duxford, Cambridgeshire. It was from this airfield that the first Spitfires took off for the Battle of Britain in July 1940. Countless Allied missions flew from airfields right across Britain, heading for Nazi-occupied Europe. But some planes never made it that far. And we head now to the Solent, where a chance discovery has prompted a large-scale diving operation. They are attempting to recover the amazingly intact remains of a Second World War bomber. The excavation is located 500 metres offshore, not far from Gosport Harbour. It was here in 2018 that the National Grid planned to lay an electricity cable to France, and they first needed to conduct an underwater survey of the seafloor.
Yeah. Right, that looks like something.
It's really hard to tell. It's been down there a long time, whatever it is.
Looks like a section of an engine, by the looks of it. Got cables there, have you? That looked like the framework of a wing or something.
They'd stumbled upon a once-in-a-lifetime discovery. A World War II bomber known as a Fairy Barracuda that appeared to be completely intact. The Barracuda was designed by British company Fairy Aviation. It was built as a torpedo dive bomber, the first of its kind made entirely from metal. It could carry a variety of deadly payloads, from 6 250-pound bombs to a 450-pound depth charge or a huge 1,600-pound torpedo. The Barracuda made its maiden flight in December 1940 and was operated by the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm. At the discovery site under the Solent, a team from Wessex Archeology have been brought in to try to raise this extraordinary plane from the seafloor.
The aircraft is buried in a buttery type mud, which is not easy when it comes to excavation. Above the seabed, very little remains. But as we are excavating down, more and more is becoming open to us.
More than 2,600 Barracudas were built, but not a single complete plane survives today. Dave Morris from the Fleet Air Arm Museum in Somerset is heading up an ambitious project to reconstruct an entire Barracuda using salvaged parts.
We have crash site remains from a number of barracudas which have been recovered over more than 40 years of collecting now, but they've all been subject to, very fast collisions to high ground mountainsides. This is the first time that we've come across a barracuda which is largely still intact and in most of its original shape.
It will be a dream come true for Dave's rebuild project if the plane can be raised in one piece.
It's pretty amazing. You descend down the shot line and you see the remains of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that is quite prominent on the seabed. As you go further back, there are the remains of the fuselage, the cockpit and the wings that are still in place.
Records note that a barracuda took off on the 6th of January 1944 from HMS Daedalus, which is now the nearby Lyon-Solent airfield. It suffered engine failure and pitched into the sea. The pilot managed to bail out and survived the crash.
We know that it was a fairly smooth belly landing rather than a violent crash. We know the pilot escaped okay. So there's a lot of information we're putting together from records and also matching that against the evidence that we're finding on the seabed now.
Before the plane can be raised, a powerful underwater siphon pump is used to suck the mud out from around the fuselage and wings. But working out how to raise the plane intact is proving to be a significant challenge. The divers realise the frame is much more fragile than they previously thought. The mud is tightly packed into the individual component parts, making the plane very heavy and likely to break up on lifting.
We're going to have to dismantle the aircraft underwater because unfortunately it's too fragile to bring up in one piece.
Despite the setback, the divers have managed to isolate a large part of one of the wings and are carefully preparing it for lifting. Slowly, the unbroken wing piece is brought up from the seafloor. Once out of the water, the team need to work quickly.
It starts to decay as soon as it comes out. It's been in the sea for 75 years or so. When you're trying to conserve archaeological material, you want to try and keep it in the same conditions to how it's been. What we're going to do is wrap it up and then keep it at least wet, damp, to try and stop the corrosion continuing.
The plane hasn't come up in one piece, but as more parts are slowly brought to the surface, Dave Morris is optimistic.
Absolutely amazed to see, obviously, a piece of the barracuda coming up after 76 years. Yeah, you can still tap on the aluminium. I expected it to be a lot more corroded, considering it's been down there for so many years.
Later on, we'll be following the recovered parts of the plane, which will be taken to the Fleet Air Arm Museum. For now, Dave still has high hopes he can use these parts to help complete his reconstruction of this long-forgotten plane. Our next dig is in the Lake District, where archaeologists are excavating the site of a very special hostel. It was a temporary home for hundreds of children who were rescued from concentration camps in Nazi-occupied Europe and brought to Britain to start a new life. On the shore of Lake Windermere, in the heart of the Lake District, is the village of Troutbeck Bridge. The archaeologists here are hoping to shed light on an incredible wartime story of survival against the odds.
The Holocaust isn't just something that happened in Eastern Europe. We have sites related to the Holocaust here on British shores. So this is one of them. We're excavating the remains of what we think is a hostel where Jewish children were brought at the end of the war.
The dig is organised by the Lake District Holocaust Project. It aims to remember the special role this area played in helping to rehabilitate children liberated from Nazi concentration camps at the end of the war. Two boys that came here in 1945 were Ike Alterman and Sam Laskier.
That's me, a cheerful little fella.
Life in Poland for these Jewish boys changed dramatically the moment Germany invaded in September 1939.
We were lined up
The assessment came and started counting. Father was in front and I was behind him. And he said to me, stand on your tiptoe to make you look a bit taller than you are. Next to him was my mother, my sister, my little brother. All those on the right, stay where you are. All those on the left, march out through the front of the square there. That's my mother, my little brother, sister, never to be seen again.
Both boys were sent to a succession of concentration camps before ending up in Auschwitz-Birkenau.
You had a number tattooed. See, that was tattooed to me in Birkenau.
But then in May 1945, the boys were finally liberated from a camp in Czechoslovakia.
We were in the wagon. We didn't know what was going on. But suddenly, we looked around, and there were no guards. They just disappeared. And that is the moment that we realized we were free. I am the one waving his hat. Everybody's so happy. We're alive. We're alive. We couldn't believe.
On the 13th of August, they were flown from Prague and brought by bus up to Windermere.
Well,
I knew wherever they're taking me, it's going to be much better wherever I was.
The boys were housed in one of 3 hostels located on what was the Calgarth estate, a town that had been built during the war to house workers from the nearby Sunderland flying boat factory. After the war, the town was demolished and a school was built here. This is the first time the site has been excavated. The team are hoping to find evidence of one of the hostel buildings in the hope that they can learn something about the lives of the children that were brought here.
We're finding huge amounts still exist within the ground. So that includes the sort of types of material that the structures were made from. So we're finding bricks and concrete and mortar. We're finding things like window glass.
300 orphaned Jewish children were brought to the Lake District. They were known as the Windermere Boys.
Many of the children who came here had been in Bergen-Belsen, some of them had been in Auschwitz, but other slave labour camps, forced labour camps, in ghettos across Europe. So for many, many years, they'd experienced terrible, terrible atrocities. They were very much alone. They didn't know how many of their family members survived.
But not all of the Windermere Boys were actually boys. In fact, 28 of them were girls. Denise's mother, Minia, was one of them.
My mum was very proud to be one of the boys, although they were in the minority, because they made a fuss of the girls as well. There had plenty of boys to choose from.
Denise has been helping out with the dig.
We found lots of pieces of tiles and water pipes, or sewage pipes. We were thinking that it's probably some kind of bathroom. I was thinking my mum must have had to wash in the bathroom over there.
The team are finding lots of evidence of the hostel building, but precious few personal items.
One of the objects that we found, quite a poignant one, we think, and it's a little tiny plastic unicorn, which may or may not have been as a pendant around somebody's neck.
So this looks to be a really interesting find of a small penknife. It looks like it's made of mother of pearl, but it's so corroded that the blade can't actually come out. It's the kind of thing that, you know, a child would have had and really looked after and carried around with them everywhere.
It may have been more than 70 years ago, but Sam and Ike's memories of arriving in Windermere are still vivid.
First of all, we arrived at night, so we didn't know much. The following morning, you see the hills and the lake. We had our place near the lakes as well. And we thought, this is paradise.
This is the main hall. That's me. over here. There was beds, clean sheets, pillowcases. We would run outside, you know, we didn't have any proper things to wear. Some went out in their underpants and that. We were wild. We were wild. It was the most fantastic feeling.
Although the rescued children only lived here for 6 months, it was a life-changing experience. They were offered counselling and schooling, including English lessons, before being resettled elsewhere in the UK.
It is a very positive story of hope in a terrible time of despair. And I think it's really important to humanise the stories of refugees.
Today, Ike and Sam have come back to the village as they're keen to see the excavation.
It is very important, and it's very important that we also tell people what it was like. Although a lot of things have changed, but we kept the memories.
The dig has helped local residents reconnect with this unique and important time in their village's history.
Archaeology speaks to people in a special kind of way, and I think we owe the survivors and the children the chance to you know, put their story out there, and I think that's what archaeology can do.
I've invited Kevin to come and tell me more about the project.
Kevin, you've been digging in the Lake District, but your usual work focusing on the Holocaust takes you over to Eastern Europe. So this is a very different kind of dig for you.
Yeah, absolutely. We do a lot in Eastern Europe. Looking at the archaeology of what happened during the Holocaust takes us to Poland and Ukraine and those sort of areas. But this project gave us the opportunity to do something a little bit closer to home.
And you did find a selection of quite personal objects. So I think this one really stands out for me, this little horse.
So we're not sure whether it's a horse or a unicorn. I think it's a unicorn, or it's an important object. It dates to around late 30s, 40s, so it's the right sort of period, with a unicorn being a mythical creature associated with hope and magic.
Yeah.
To find that on the site where we were looking for evidence of what these boys went through and how they lived their life in Windermere, then that was a perfect start for us, actually, to
lovely.
find that.
Is it a little pendant?
A little pendant, yeah. Wear around the neck.
Yeah. What I find really kind of moving about this is that, you know, that might be something that I dig up in my garden at home, and it has very little meaning attached to it. In this context,
absolutely,
it comes with all that meaning.
And then
what's that? A tube?
Interesting, curly top. So it's a hair curling gel, but it's made for toddlers and babies.
Yes, it says for toddlers.
For toddlers.
Curly top.
So it's to make your baby's hair grow curly.
The natural hair curler for toddlers.
So it would have been a culture shock to these children to all of a sudden be in an environment where you could curl your baby's hair using a gel.
And then, what about this buckle?
Quite important. It's a belt buckle. It's quite common to the period. So we're talking sort of 1930s, 1940s, right through to the 50s. It could well be that this belonged to one of them.
What else have we got? There's a bottle top.
Yeah, V-nose, and that is a cough medicine. It just demonstrates that these children went from having no medical care whatsoever to all of a sudden to find themselves in a place where if they got a cough, they would be given some V-nose cough medicine by a nurse or a doctor.
Yeah.
It just demonstrates how dramatically their life changed overnight.
Yeah. And the care that was suddenly around them.
Absolutely.
Do you think finding objects like this, does it make it feel as though that time is more distant or closer to the present day when you find these objects?
The sort of argument here is that why do we do archaeology on such a recent period? Because we already know the answers, because we've got books and photographs and all sorts of things. But actually I think it's important because archaeologists look at evidence and data in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
So we are asking new questions of these archived documents and these data. So actually we can present new evidence, and that's what this project is all about. It's bringing to the forefront this little section of Windermere in the 1940s just to see what the life was like for these people.
We now turn our attention to another group of people who came to Britain during the war. In the build-up to D-Day, military camps sprung up right across the country. As well as housing British soldiers, these sites were home to thousands of Canadian and American troops. Our next dig comes from Salisbury, where a team of British ex-military personnel are hoping to find the remains of a barracks used by the 2nd Battalion of the US Army's 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, otherwise known as Easy Company. The men of this elite American parachute unit also came to be known as the Band of Brothers. They came to Britain in September 1943 and remained here for 9 months, preparing alongside other Allied troops for the D-Day invasion. Their training camp was located near the village of Aldbourne in Wiltshire. MOD archaeologist Richard Osgood is on site with members of Operation Nightingale. This is an initiative using archaeology to support the recovery of military personnel injured in conflict.
On the surface you can see nothing. This is just a sports pitch. What we wanted to do to see if archaeology could tell us anything about what lies below this surface and link us to those men from Easy Company and take us back to those days of D-Day.
We know from military photographs that in 1943 and 44, this field housed a number of wooden barracks. This was the first time these young soldiers had left their base in America.
Some of them described it as the best accommodation they had in the whole war, and others said they felt that they were on a Hollywood film set because this village is so beautiful.
But the paratroopers would soon leave this quaint Wiltshire village far behind. In the early hours of the 6th of June 1944, the men of Easy Company were dropped behind enemy lines in Normandy. Their mission to seize key bridges and clear routes leading away from Utah Beach to allow safe passage of US ground troops who would arrive by sea just a few hours later. The plan went awry, with many missing their drop zone. But they still managed to capture and destroy 4 German field guns, saving countless Allied lives. Easy Company went on to become one of the best-known Allied fighting forces in the war, even making it all the way to Hitler's mountaintop retreat in the Bavarian Alps. Back at the dig, the team are hoping to find some personal items. They want to gain a glimpse into the lives of these soldiers when they were stationed here during the weeks leading up to the D-Day invasion.
One of the really exciting bits about archaeology is when you're able to put yourselves literally in the footsteps of people that did incredible deeds in the past.
Already they're finding telltale structures just beneath the surface.
Not many people get excited by concrete necessarily, especially 20th century concrete, but we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 pads of a building that were put into this field in the 1940s, and this is the remnants of the platoon sergeant's building.
What have you got there?
It looks like some sort of iron cooking pot, possibly.
It's a coin. It's a 1944 halfpenny.
They're also finding artefacts that directly link to Easy Company's pivotal role on D-Day.
Just pulled this out of the ground and we didn't have a clue what it was, but we borrowed Paul's book and we found out exactly what it was. It's the handle for the emergency parachutes. Yeah,
oh my
fantastic.
God.
There are even finds that don't often survive being buried.
Our military expert has now identified this as being parachute silk. You're standing in a hut used by Easy Company and you're touching a piece of parachute silk used by those paratroopers, and that's amazing. Is as good as a link to D-Day as you're ever going to get.
Eagerly sought personal items are also surfacing. They're helping to paint a picture of life outside of combat training.
This is a fairly fun piece of evidence. It's a bottle of Brill cream that they'd have put in their hair to make themselves look presentable, having had their training and got themselves ready for an evening out. One of the local buildings was a place where the Americans did a lot of their dancing with the local girls. The story goes that they made such good use of that venue that at the end of the war they had to pay for the floor to be relaid. The hall still exists today. The floor's in really good condition.
The dig is giving a unique insight into the reality of daily life for these brave men just at that moment before they left Britain for D-Day in June 1944.
This particular room, and I'm just standing by the entrance looking into the hut, is their last moment of quiet, peace, tranquility, and probably a great deal of reflection before they dropped in on Normandy. And that adds a real element of pathos, I think, to this particular site.
I've asked Richard to bring in some of those personal items for a closer look.
And you've got some of the finds here from inside the hut, including that, which is extraordinary.
You know, the hairs on my back of my neck, when you find something like this, and we're talking paratroopers, this is a handle of a reserve parachute used by somebody in Easy Company.
So that's for your backup parachute?
That's right. Your first parachute is what's called a static line. It's pulled by the aircraft itself, and it opens up and you parachute down, hopefully, and if that doesn't work, you've got that to keep you alive.
And you've got some smaller objects, so talk me through these. What have we got here? A badge?
Well, that's a little touch of them being very human, in fact. It's a basketball supporters badge.
Let's get it under there. So there's a little basketball on there.
That's right. It says, I support, but tantalisingly, we don't know who this individual soldier supported. So you've got a little trace of them being keen on life back home, but just whom we don't know.
And this looks like something which you'd find on the head of a guitar.
I think it's a mandolin.
Oh, right.
They're passing time playing musical instruments, one of the ways that they kept themselves occupied in the evenings.
And what's this?
That is a nylon stocking found in the hut. I don't know how far we go into that. maybe some chap who'd used a lot of Brill cream and had done pretty well on his dancing skills.
Had a small gift with him.
There are numerous histories and anecdotes of the guys giving kids sweets and chewing gum, things like that, and luxuries like these stockings. So it's all part of that liaising with the locals and getting them on side. It's a nice, tantalising touch again that this soldier might have had maybe happier things happening before they went to D-Day.
Yeah. And it is like we're looking at a little American colony in 1940s Britain.
That's right. We've got one small trench, but it's given us loads of finds relating to a pivotal moment in history and a really famous group of young men. And it is about Americana, it's about what they're doing to fight, what they're doing to try and stay human. And it's just a small keyhole into those days of 1943 and 1944. And as such, I think it's actually quite a fascinating little collection of finds.
And I think what's interesting too is that you're digging with veterans who are bringing their own experiences to bear on the archaeology they're uncovering.
Completely. We had several British military guys with us who have faced combat, so they know the sorts of experiences and traumas that these men have faced. And for them, that was a really important and powerful thing, because they could directly connect to the men of Easy Company, albeit from a 21st century perspective.
Yeah.
And therefore, finding this sort of thing for them was quite an emotional experience, I think.
We now return to the raising of the ferry Barracuda bomber from the murky waters just off the south coast. All of the parts that were recovered had now been transferred to the Fleet Air Arm Museum in Somerset, and our roving archaeologist Nisha McSweeney is there to see how the team is attempting to reconstruct this long-forgotten bomber.
The discovery of an intact Barracuda bomber was a world's first. But sadly, the salvage team could not raise it in one piece and had to bring it up in parts. At the Fleet Air Arm Museum, Dave Morris is head of an ambitious project to rebuild a whole Barracuda using only original parts. For the last 40 years, they've been collecting fragments salvaged from various crash sites. But these are very difficult to use in the rebuild because they're so battered and mangled. This could all be about to change with the treasure trove of parts raised over several days from the Solent. So Dave, where are we so far with the project, putting this giant multiple jigsaw pieces back together?
If you were to look at basically the plan form of a Barracuda and think, OK, let's build one of those, I think you would stop on day one. It would just become too mind-boggling.
Chief Engineer William Gibbs has been working on the project for 5 years. He has to identify each specific part, then work out where they go. It's a complex process.
So we might put something together and then it has to come apart again.
Okay.
Which is annoying, but it's just part of the process.
So far, he's rebuilt the cockpit. So just help me visualise this a bit more. You've got the pilot sitting here, you've got the wings over here. This is the nose of the aeroplane going behind us?
The engine, yes. The
engine.
The engine would fit in front there, in front of the pilot. So we've got the engine and propeller there, and then the remainder of the aircraft. And the tail would be 30 or so feet down in that direction. So it's just a big airplane.
This is a huge plane. The project is already providing a glimpse into the working lives of the people who built these planes more than 70 years ago.
On here we've got drawings, pencil drawings, done in the factory. We were the first people to see those drawings since they were doodled on in the Bolton and Paul factory, in the factory. Pretty poor factory behaviour. You shouldn't go scribbling and doodling on airplanes, but this was wartime Great Britain, and there was a little bit of camaraderie and morale going on.
Dave is now pinning his hopes on sections of the Barracuda raised from the Solent, providing a mountain of usable parts to help complete the build.
We started finding there were hundreds of really valuable fittings, tube ends, constructional details, components for the Barracuda that we could harvest. You can't even begin to measure how useful this is for the project.
As well as large sections such as the fuselage and the wing piece, outside the hangar, individual parts harvested from the Solent wreck are undergoing chemical preservation. So what have you got in these tanks? What's the magic solution that's getting rid of all this gunk?
This is just ordinary fresh water, tap water mixed with citric acid.
The citric acid helps reduce the alkalinity of the seawater, producing a more neutral pH solution. This helps to stabilize the parts and reduce any further degradation. Let's see what we got.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Piece of pipe, bit of collecting pipe, and then we've got.
Ooh, yuck.
And the rubber's incredibly supple.
Is that rubber?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, this one does not smell good. There's a long way to go before all the components salvaged from the Solent wreck will be ready for use in the reconstruction of the plane. But Dave has already made some astonishing discoveries.
These are a pair of batteries from the Solent wreck, two 12-volt batteries, dated June 43. We couldn't resist putting a tester on the batteries, and one of them still has 0.86 residual volts of current in it. It's absolutely remarkable that after 76 years on the seabed, absolutely. So there are some remarkable, quirky little finds coming up from the Solent wreck.
I don't think I've ever seen a conservation challenge quite like this one. I'm used to working out on site with conservators to put together ancient pottery or other kinds of artifacts, and that's extremely difficult to do. But this is something on a different scale, right? The complexity of it is just ramped up hugely. The rebuild project has many years of work ahead, but Dave is now confident that with the Solent wreck, one day he will be able to wheel out a complete Barracuda, the very last of its kind.
We now move from British planes to German military hardware. One of the most destructive weapons developed by Nazi Germany was the V2 rocket, the forerunner to later ballistic missiles. Each rocket bore a warhead containing 900 kilograms of explosives, and it's thought that around 3,000 rockets were launched at Allied targets during the Second World War. We now join two brothers who are on the search for a V2 rocket, which fortunately never hit its target and ended up in a farmer's field. The hunt is focused near the village of Marden in Kent. Amateur military archaeologists Colin and Sean Welsh are on the trail of a V2 that struck here at 2:15 a.m. on the 9th of March 1945. Aerial imagery taken after the war shows it came down in this field.
We've excavated several V2 rockets and V1 flying bombs, so I'm afraid to say we've become experts.
The V2 was the forerunner to rockets that would eventually put a man on the moon. It was invented in Germany in the 1930s and later developed as an explosive missile by the Nazis. The key to its long range was the innovation of using liquid oxygen and alcohol to propel the rocket. At the dig in Kent, the brothers hoped that the remains of the rocket could reveal clues to its trajectory and how it detonated. To help locate the impact site, they use a portable magnetometer.
If there are large steel parts in the ground, that will then cause a disturbance to the magnetic orientation in the ground. The magnetometer will detect that and give us a signal.
Using the survey results, they map out what they believe is the extent of the impact crater, now buried underground. And they start to dig. Just a metre down, and they're already finding indirect evidence of the detonation.
There was an orchard here, and obviously the trees were destroyed, and the damaged trees were pushed back into the hole and buried with the infill. And the one that you can see standing up just there, that's got a broken off top, which would have been caused by the blast of the device.
Strong magnetometer readings down in the hole indicate they're still on target. The heavy clay soil makes it difficult to locate small finds, but it does have its benefits.
This is the tiniest little bit here, and the aluminium looks almost fresh in the find, and that's because of the absence of oxygen in the hole. That's a good sign. It means that any future finds are going to be, hopefully, in a good state of preservation.
The V2 had a maximum range of 320 kilometres and travelled at over 1,000 metres per second.
It was travelling so fast that you could be stood at this spot and not know that a V2 was approaching. You wouldn't see it coming, you wouldn't hear it coming.
Launched at Britain from sites in the Nazi-controlled Netherlands, the V2s caused an estimated 9,000 British civilian and military deaths. As the brothers dig deeper, recognisable pieces of the rocket are now starting to emerge.
This is one of the support brackets for either the oxygen tank or the alcohol tank. That's quite a nice find. Let's just see what my brother concurs.
Right, well, I know what it is. But that's one of the clamps for the fuel tanks.
But I just said that I'd get you to confirm it with me.
OK, so you haven't told... Well,
I've told them.
OK, well, I'll come down again, show what a pair of nerds we are, that we know every bit of a V2 rocket.
Should be nearby. There's something...
Deeper still, and key parts of the supersonic engine are coming to light.
It doesn't look like very much at the moment, but this is a burner cup from the combustion chamber of the V2 rocket. I can tell that it's a burner cup because of that little bit of brass there, which was an injector nozzle. So alcohol was pushed through that to squirt a feed into the combustion chamber. There were 18 of these, and this is the first one out of our excavation. 3.1.
As the excavation continues, the brothers make an intriguing discovery, linked to the precise moment of impact.
When we look down in there, we can see that the clay itself has changed colour. Rather than the nice bright yellow-orange in the surrounds, it's a horrible grey colour, which I think is due to the carbonisation of the materials.
The V2 was exploding as it travelled into the ground at 3 times the speed of sound. The detonation couldn't keep up with how fast it was travelling, so it got in at least 5 feet into the ground before it actually detonated.
This is a fascinating revelation.
The original intention was to try and create something like a blast weapon on the surface. What they didn't bargain for, the supersonic speed, took the rocket further into soft ground than they might have expected.
This V2 rocket had clearly gone off target when it hit the field. And it only detonated once it had penetrated the ground. The blast from its warhead would have been absorbed by the clay. 6 meters down, the brothers finally reached the bottom of the impact crater. The plan now is to clean and preserve the finds and scan them to create a digital archive.
I quite enjoy the physics of the excavation. I particularly enjoy building a representation of what it was that happened at the site. We found a lot about the geology and what it does to the finds. I think we've done pretty well.
Colin and Sean's excavation is part of an ongoing investigation into the role this terrifying weapon had on Britain during the war. Prior to D-Day in June 1944, the Allied forces staged a number of rehearsals of the landings, all in top secret. One of these was called Operation Tiger, and it would end in absolute tragedy. But because of the secrecy, very few people knew about it. Then, in the 1970s, one man uncovered evidence of the event and fought to bring the story to light. Nisha McSweeney met his son.
The incident took place off the Devon coast near Slapton Sands. Operation Tiger may have remained a forgotten moment in history if it wasn't for the amateur archaeological sleuthing of a local man named Ken Small. I'm meeting his son Dean to find out more.
When did your father first begin to suspect that there was something out there?
He was beachcombing and he came across things like tunic buttons, empty shell cases, identity bracelets, various parts of identity bracelets, all these bits, knives and forks, spoons, parts of them. And he thought, well, this is weird. Why would this be on a beach?
A local fisherman added to the mystery. He told Ken about a spot just out from the beach where their nets would snag on something large underwater. In the summer of 1974, Ken persuaded a diver friend to go down and take a look.
My dad took him out in a boat. He dived down, he came up and he said to my dad, it's a tank. And my dad said, well, what, an oil tank, water tank? He said, no, it's like an army tank. And my dad just thought, this is crazy, how can this be?
Ken started to search local records and military archives for answers. It was then that he stumbled across a wartime exercise, codenamed Operation Tiger. Operation Tiger was carried out in April 1944. It was one of a number of practice exercises involving troops from Britain, the US and Canada that all took place in preparation for the Normandy landings. 30,000 US troops were sent to Slapton Sands to rehearse their part in D-Day.
All of this stuff was completely covered up. So there was very little evidence as to what went on, the actual exercises themselves.
Determined to find out more about the tank, in May 1984, Ken took amateur maritime archaeology to a new level. With the help of friends and local divers, he raised the tank off the seafloor.
They got a big bulldozer, they strapped a cable to it, and they started to pull it along the concrete slipway. And amazingly, the tracks started to turn.
It's incredible.
Yeah, and then all the crustacea and stuff that had grown on the tank over years of being under the water all started to break away and crumble off. And you can actually see grease still on the thing. It's just amazing.
The tank was immediately jet cleaned and sprayed with rust preventer to protect it from decay.
So, this is it?
This is the tank.
It's enormous! It's amazing to think about this under the water, and of course they were snagging their nets. And
yeah.
Dean, this is crazy for me. So I'm used to when I dig up, iron objects from the Iron Age, they come up as like really crusty, corroded things. It's hard to tell what they are, but this is in fabulous condition.
Ken had recovered an American amphibious Sherman DD tank.
So what happens is, all around the tank, there's this flotation collar, and it's raised with compressed air upwards, and it forms a complete skirt around the tank.
Fantastic. So it's a fully amphibious tank. Tank, boat, tank.
While the DD tank was ahead of its time, it could be quite unreliable. Several of them, including the one Ken raised off the seafloor, were known to have sunk during the D-Day rehearsals due to mechanical faults. But as Ken investigated further, he discovered that Operation Tiger wasn't just blighted by technical problems. Something far more deadly had occurred. By early 1944, the Germans knew Allied forces were planning to invade Nazi-controlled France. They just weren't sure where or when. By listening in to the Allied radio chatter, they got wind of Operation Tiger. On the 28th of April 1944, 9 German E-boats were sent out on patrol and headed for the coast of Devon. Armed with torpedoes, these were highly maneuverable, deadly attack craft. That night, Allied ships taking part in Operation Tiger came under attack. 2 US tank landing ships were sunk and 3 more badly damaged. More than 700 US servicemen drowned or died of hypothermia as they waited to be rescued. In 2012, 2 wartime shipwrecks known to lie off the Devon coast were formally identified as the 2 tank landing ships, or LSTs, that were sunk during Operation Tiger. As part of a project to grant the wrecks special status, maritime archaeologist Graham Scott is heading out to survey them.
What's really important about these wrecks is that they're associated with D-Day, and they're associated with practices for D-Day. Historic England have asked us to investigate these wrecks for them and to advise them what's left of them and how important they are.
Now anchored over the wrecks, they prepare to send down a remotely operated vehicle, or ROV. Equipped with sonar and specialist low-light cameras, the team can stream a live feed from 50 metres down, direct to the control room.
OK, mate, that's us. We got visual. We'll just work out what we're doing.
Let's orientate ourselves and let's move along to the west.
Today, Graham is concentrating on one of the ships. He wants to assess what state it's in, what equipment it was carrying, and any potentially live munitions still on board.
We are wondering whether we have found a gun here. We are rather hoping that this is evidence of the ship's armament. We could be wrong.
We start tethering easy. Tethering easy.
One thing we have to be careful with on a wreck like this is the presence of ammunition. We don't touch any of that. We back the ROV away to a safe distance. So we've no real idea whether these things are still viable. We've got to treat them as though they could still potentially explode if we blunder into them.
Moving along the boat, the ROV camera captures a lifeboat crane, a cargo net, and the engine.
The hull is upside down. These were very shallow drafted vessels and they tended to capsize when they sank.
We now know that on the night of the attack, chaos ensued.
The men on board the landing ships thought that the firing initially was part of the exercise. And it was only when one of the ships was torpedoed and they saw this massive explosion that they realized they were actually under attack. And then all hell breaks loose. Everybody starts firing everywhere. Very confusing.
Following the deadly Nazi attack, the Operation Tiger disaster was quickly covered up. It remained largely unknown for decades, until Ken Small found and raised his tank. While the tank was not sunk in the enemy attack, it now stands as a permanent memorial to all the US servicemen who lost their lives during the D-Day rehearsal. Ken's son Dean still has his father's collection of artifacts.
These didn't come out of the tank.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did. This one here is a rangefinder, and this, I believe, is used to work out the elevation for the main gun. The main gun in the turret of the tank.
Yeah, line of fire.
Line of fire. Yeah.
In recognition of Ken's determination to bring the story of Operation Tiger to light, and remember the American soldiers who lost their lives. He received a letter of gratitude from the president.
Dear Mr. Small,
Yes.
on behalf of all Americans, thank you for your kind and generous efforts. Sincerely, Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
I think it's a really important story that deserves to be much more widely told. I mean, it's a big kind of part of the preparations for D-Day, which we just hadn't heard about. It took someone like Ken to get that story out there and to give those people who died and their families and the survivors a voice and something to kind of remember it by.
During the war, Northern Ireland had 28 airfields home to both RAF and US Army Air Force crews. Whether through combat damage, mechanical failure or pilot error, not every plane returned home. For our final dig, a team of archaeologists has been joined by an army of volunteer schoolchildren from both sides of the Irish border, and they are excavating the site of a crashed American fighter plane. On December the 17th, 1942, 22-year-old American pilot, Second Lieutenant Milo Rundell, was returning to the Royal Naval Air Station at Eglinton when he went off course. As part of an ongoing project to highlight the role played by Northern Ireland during the war, aviation historian Johnny McNee has been trying to find Rundell's plane.
We have eyewitnesses said a plane crashed in this direction. What we're trying to work out from the archaeology, is that correct? And the orientation of the aircraft did it go in vertically? Did it sort of bounce across the field and then sadly bury itself into a corner?
Rundell parachuted safely down into Northern Ireland and returned to base. But his plane hit the ground somewhere near the town of Castle Blaney in County Monaghan, just south of the border in Ireland. While parts of the plane were recovered at the time of the crash, it hit the ground so hard that much of it still lies buried.
We're fairly sure that these are engine parts. Lots of cables, clamps, ducts, bits of very contorted and smashed up metalwork with a distinct aroma of fuel off it.
It looks to be part of the outside we're thinking because it has that greenish paint on it.
Not 100% sure. We have a long hinged object here. Could be a door, could be... It's very light material.
Records reveal that Lieutenant Rundell was flying a US fighter plane known as a Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The P-38 was the first fighter aircraft to fly faster than 400 miles per hour. With its 4 nose-mounted machine guns and 20mm cannon, it was feared by Allied enemies. The Japanese called it 2 planes, 1 pilot because of its unusual design. The Germans knew it as the fork-tailed devil. Back at the dig, Johnny is now finding clues that can be traced back to where the plane was manufactured.
We're finding lots of these little fuel clamps. And these clamps hold, the insulation and rubber tubing around various parts. You can see the manufacturer, the patent number, so it's WWII Manufacturing Company, Chicago, USA. And even look at that. Still threaded, still working.
We know that WWII made fuel clamps for the P-38, so the team are definitely digging in the right place. Johnny is now recognising other specific parts of the plane.
That's a serious bit of sheet steel. That must be 5, 6, 7 mil thick, so it's not light aluminium. It's there for a purpose, and that purpose would be to stop bullets hitting the pilot or the engine components.
Confident they have found Rundell's P-38 Lightning, the layout and condition of the wreckage is also providing clues as to how it crashed.
The debris that we're getting here suggests that the aircraft did enter the ground almost, I would say, at about a 70, 80 degree angle into the ground. So you've got to imagine this iconic design, 2 engines, without a pilot, roaring from across the sky, running low on fuel from the west. It's come in almost vertical
into our stony field. And this iconic design has been turned in a matter of seconds into this crumpled pile of metal that you can see.
For the schoolchildren volunteers, the dig is giving them a tangible connection to the brave young pilots that were based near here almost 80 years ago.
Sort of bringing history to life. So it's like relating the artifacts to what we're learning, and we can see really like what happened and how it would have like looked in an outside perspective.
I've asked Johnny to bring in some of the finds to see what else we can learn about this plane and its pilot.
So what have we got here then? Where do these parts belong to on the Lightning?
You've got little inlet exhaust valves from the engine, broken bits of the cockpit that locks the cockpit latches down when you shut it and go flying. And you can see the little serrated buttons here just for locking your cockpit closed. We have some of the perspex, still with the distinct wartime olive drab paint on it. And some of the very fearsome nose armament was also recovered. So we have 2 50 caliber bullets. There are 4 50 caliber Browning machine guns on the front, plus a 20mm cannon.
And then there's a plate here.
Yes, that was one of the star finds by the pupils. I mean, they really were forensically going through the soil. And one of them said, "Oh, I've got a little plate with writing on it." And you can see there all the drawing information, the contract, the date, tells you the oil capacity, and then right at the bottom, Lockheed Aviation Corps. So that 100% proves that we were dealing with the crash of a Lockheed P-38. That was a good find.
Well, what on earth are those?
They came out, if you can imagine, in our profile, we had engine wreckage, cockpit wreckage, and engine wreckage. And these were in the cockpit. And there was a lot of head scratching amongst the team. You know, people were suggesting they were like butter paddles or they were something agricultural.
Yeah.
And we put some articles into the P-38 Association magazine in America and said, does anybody know what these are? Before we make some grand announcement and look stupid.
Yeah.
And a guy came back and says, your plane was going to fly in the Mediterranean Theatre of Operations. Those go into the air intakes to stop that sandy wind from blowing in and clogging up your engines. And then you can see traces of yellow paint on the handle, so they would flag up as you're doing your walk around in the morning. Right, I better take these out.
Yeah, you don't want to fly with them still in, do you?
No, that would be a bad day.
And what happened to the pilots themselves?
Yes, so Second Lieutenant Milo Rundal from Iowa. He then goes to Tunisia, and less than a month later, he is shot down, and he ends up being captured and then taken to Stalag Luft 3, and he was there for the rest of the war, and he was there during the time when the Great Escape was taking place.
Is he still with us?
No, sadly he passed away in 2006, but his daughter tells us that he was a great patriot, loved the P-38, and he did a lot of flying after the war as well, but a lot of time for the P-38. And when I said, what do you think he would think of what, you know, we and the pupils are doing here?
Yeah.
And he said, like, that generation, he would have laughed. I said, what are you doing, you know, looking after my old P-38? You know, what's all the fuss about?
Yeah.
He was just that, you know, greatest generation type of a character.
Although the Second World War happened just 80 years ago and we have plenty of historical records of the time, archaeology provides us with different insights and personal connections with this important episode in our country's history. The United Kingdom has an epic history and a wealth of secrets still to uncover. Every year, hundreds of archaeologists dig, dive, and sieve to find clues, to add to the great historical jigsaw of our ancestors' lives.
You know when people say, what's the best thing you've ever found, guys? This.
I'm Professor Alice Roberts.
This year we've uncovered some astonishing finds and made some truly groundbreaking discoveries.
Wow, look at that.
Each team of archaeologists has been armed with a dig diary camera so they can record their discoveries as they happen.
That is brilliant. Dave, I love you.
Our roving archaeologist, Dr. Nisha McSweeney, is out on the digs.
Who are we looking at?
It's royal.
And I'll be inviting the teams to bring in their finds for closer analysis.
That is absolutely beautiful.
This time we're exploring the south of Britain, where archaeologists have been making incredible discoveries both above and below the waves. From a Stone Age settlement found off the Dorset coast,
incredible sight. You know, nothing else like it in the country.
To an Elizabethan theatre in the heart of London.
It must have been such a raucous pace. It's kind of 16th century EastEnders.
And a mysterious Iron Age burial near Dorchester.
I've been working in Dorset for over 40 years and I've never come across anything like this.
Welcome to Digging for Britain. After the invasion of Britain in 43 AD by the Roman Emperor Claudius, it was here in the south that the first forts and settlements grew up. Archaeologists in East Sussex are out investigating one of these early settlements, but with no Roman records of this place, its name and its purpose have been lost in time. The excavation is located around 10 miles northeast of Brighton, in the village of Barkham. The site was first discovered in 2011 by chance. Archaeologist Rob Wallace was excavating part of a Roman road when a wider geophysical survey revealed a possible settlement.
This survey is magnetometry, so it picks up the magnetic variations in the earth, especially in the Roman period and other periods. You tend to get a lot of charcoal and burnt material, which is very magnetic. So these will show up ditches, linear features. So the geophysics we use is an indication that there's something there, rather than actually telling us what it is there.
Artefacts already uncovered suggest this settlement was already in existence by 70 AD, just 27 years after the Roman invasion. With no historical records to help us here, Rob is trying to work out the role this settlement might have played in the wider context of Roman Britannia. He looks first for clues in its layout and location.
Original settlement around about 70 AD is round here, and it's a small 4-grid system. The Roman road, which goes to London, comes up through here. We have the Greensand Way, which is the east-west route, which goes to Hardham and then Chichester. And we have a road going eastwards to Arlington and then on to Pevensey.
As well as the roads heading off in all directions, the settlement is also very close to a waterway.
The River Ouse is a tidal river. It was probably a lot wider and shallower in the Roman period. The Romans would have used flat-bottom boats anyway, and it's an easy way to move mass bulk. So possibly grains and things like that, iron ore that's coming out from the Weald.
While the Romans are famous for their road building, waterways were just as important. They used seagoing merchant ships to transport goods in and out of the country, and river barges for transporting goods within it.
So you can move stuff in mass. They can move around the rivers rather than on carts, which is more costly and time-consuming. So basically we have north, south, east and west covered from this location.
This is a key revelation. The site was well connected by roads and river to other Roman settlements in the region. The team also discover that the site itself is surrounded by a ditch.
If we look out here, you'll see that hedgerow, which goes all the way up to that corner. It's then coming all the way up, 3/4 of the way up to there. That hedgerow is this enclosure ditch, is the inner enclosure ditch. It then comes back across the site, it levels up with the oak tree and comes down to form this around it.
The ditch suggests a certain level of fortification. It meant that you could only get in through approved entry points. The ditch was a way of controlling who and what came in and out of the site. Further clues to the role of this settlement come in the huge variety of artefacts that are being unearthed, including over 300 coins.
So here we have a Septimus Severus coin, around about 198 to 200 AD, which is silver from this year's excavation. Yeah, so it's quite a collection. They date from early Roman right the way through to 435 AD.
Along with the coins, evidence is also building of a site rich in material goods coming from all over Britain.
This is a mortoria bowl. This is a whiteware, possibly from Oxford, and they normally have a grit inclusion in the actual base, and these are used for mixing, so they'll have maybe greens and stuff like that with olive oil.
There are also goods coming in from further afield.
So here you have a lion attacking another animal. You've got different gladiatorial scenes throughout.
This is a great example of the classic red Roman pottery known as Samian ware.
As it's got the maker's stamp on it, it's been manufactured in Gaul, which is France, modern-day France, from the Roman period.
They're even finding pieces of Roman glass.
You can see some inclusions in it if you look up to the light. There's some little bubbles. But this would have been the neck and possibly comes out to a square bottle.
There's no evidence for glass making from scratch in Roman Britain, so once again this is evidence of luxury goods being imported from across the Roman world. Caught on their dig diary camera, the site is continuing to yield a constant flow of intriguing artefacts.
I'm sticking my neck out on this one, but it could be the...
There you go. Oh, look at that. Maybe that is that.
Like it grew there.
Wow.
Like it grew there, look.
This year, the team are also finding evidence of manufacturing processes taking place within the settlement itself.
We've got a part of a kiln here in situ, and that is the base of it, which would have went across and up to where the white chalk is.
This kiln could have been used to make tiles and pottery for the town, or potentially for export. The finds are helping to paint a picture of this forgotten Roman settlement. The archaeologists have unearthed artefacts that have arrived here from across the Roman world, as well as large numbers of coins. And then there are those road and river access routes. Rob is considering the possibility that this could have been an important trading hub, and possibly even a centre for Roman administration.
The finds indicate that it's an official site. It's under the Roman government's control, so people will be here collecting taxes, or if goods are coming in, looking at what's coming in and what's going out, and see if there's any taxes to pay on that.
With each season, they're discovering that this trading settlement is far larger than previously thought. Rob and his team plan to keep coming back for many years to come.
You never know what you're going to find from one day to the next. You can be, a small bit of pot, or a coin, or a brooch, or, something more personal. It's an amazing feeling.
Leaving the Roman era, we now peer further back into British prehistory. Our next dig sees archaeologists donning scuba gear and plunging into the chilly waters of the Solent to investigate an extremely ancient Stone Age settlement. Just off the coast of the Isle of Wight lies one of the UK's most unusual archaeological sites. Today, a team from the Maritime Archeology Trust, led by Gary Momber, are planning to survey the site. And they hope to raise what is thought to be an 8,000-year-old timber structure for further analysis.
Pretty good. The first dive of the day. Visibility is a few metres. Tides dropping off, running quite fast. But it's just incredible seeing these lovely layers of trim wood lying flat there. 8,000 years old. First time it's been uncovered. Okay, Dave, they're ready.
And go.
Lying just 11 metres beneath the waves, are worked timbers that date back to the Mesolithic, or Middle Stone Age. The Mesolithic was a time before farming, when the people living in Britain were still nomadic hunter-gatherers.
What I love is really getting on the site and uncovering. It's just finding things for the first time in 8,000 years, and then knowing that that's going to tell us so much about those people.
This site was discovered over 20 years ago by an unusual sort of archaeologist, a lobster.
We saw this lobster kicking out these flints from a hole. I thought, oh, that's really nice. He picked up these little bits of flint and brought them to the surface and said, look, worked flints on the seabed. And that was how we found it.
Well-preserved Mesolithic sites are incredibly rare. Archaeologists often just find scatters of worked flint, like the ones the lobster discovered. But when these archaeologists excavated around the lobster's burrow, they started to find ancient timbers.
There's lots of wood, there's structures being built, there's posts, there are these sort of series of these sort of platforms that are put in place. There seems to be a living spot.
But these ancient structures are under threat. For 8,000 years, the wood has been preserved under a blanket of silt and mud. Now, changing currents are causing extensive erosion along this stretch of coastline, exposing the timbers and leaving the wood open to attack.
As you get these wood-boring organisms, you get piddock and gribble, move into it, dig lots of holes, and you see it in the sample, so everything's sort of compromised and undermined.
Underwater, the divers are completing a survey of the site. It can be a very difficult work environment.
The harder the current is running, the harder it is for you to work. And because you're operating in 3 dimensions, it's not just on a flat surface, you're up and down as well. So it adds challenge to the diving, which is the whole point of doing this for me.
The ancient timbers are photographed and each piece logged and tagged. The divers then start to bring them to the surface.
This is the sort of material that we've got on the seabed. And see what they've done is they have got bits of timber and they've sliced it. So it's flat on one side, and on the other side it's sort of bark, another one there. And they've sort of overlaid them to form a sort of layer or platform on the seabed.
The specific purpose of these timber platforms is still unknown, but Gary has a working hypothesis.
We know it was wet round here, but boggy, so they would have been, would have been a nice platform to stand on and walk on, a dry area for whatever activity they might have been doing.
These Mesolithic people seem to have constructed something quite permanent. This is clearly much more than just a temporary camp. It challenges our ideas about Mesolithic hunter-gatherers as nomads always on the move.
These things are very rare because this was a hunter-gatherer society that was known to move around the place. But here we got, well, it looks more like a settlement. It looks more like there's been a lot of time invested in this particular site. Well, it would have been a special place to live at the time. It would have been a nice little sheltered valley. You're very near sources of flints, just in the chalk cliffs. You would have had wildfowl, you've had vegetation, a place that you could probably live all year round.
Over the course of the day, the divers have been steadily bringing up the whole Mesolithic platform, piece by piece. Coming up from the last dive, Gary brings up the final parts.
That was good. That's the last big piece on top. They've all come up in much more pieces, but this was a big plank sitting on top. Degraded, but it's just one hefty piece of timber. There's just, there's a whole landscape down there that we really want to, it's just not enough. We need more time. Incredible site. Nothing else like it in the country.
All of the artefacts that were lifted from the seabed are now in the National Oceanography Centre in Southampton, and our roving archaeologist Nisha McSweeney is visiting their labs.
Okay, yeah, so what we're going to do is take you inside.
Excavating an underwater prehistoric site has its challenges, but piecing the finds back together is a whole new headache.
No. So, Gary, what are we doing today?
Well,
These boxes contain all the artefacts, all the parts of the platform that we lifted. They've been in cold storage. We're going to get them out now and we're going to reconstruct them for the first time.
Oh, it's cold. That water's cold.
So we keep them cold and dark and in fresh water to minimise the degradation and to keep them stable for as long as possible. We got to spend time analysing it and recording it. And it's only when we've done that that we can extract the information that will tell us about these people of which we know so little.
They're still really delicate. I guess we have to handle them with a lot of care.
A lot of it's been eaten away by these marine boring organisms. They drill down into it. See the grain of a worm that's gone through. It tracks through here.
The platform is quite a complex structure, made up of several layers of what once was interlocking wood.
We don't have any other blueprints of Mesolithic platforms. This is the first one.
The structure is one thing, but there's also how are they doing it, and how are they converting trees into different sorts of planks, and what tools are they using. So all those sort of questions will come out of this.
Each piece was given a unique number underwater, which we should now be able to match up against the team's photographs. It's quite a challenge to rebuild.
So this is piece 51.
Which is this one here.
That
so
one.
you now have to turn it around the other way.
Right. This one looks like it's 022.
Or 25.
Possibly. 20 smudge. Oh, that's a big bit.
Another one.
There's a big bit. It's a puzzle, and I'm puzzled because it's not just there, it's different layers. Bits go underneath, over each other, they kind of interweave. It's the whole kind of interlocking, interlacing, puzzle-tastic platform.
In trying to put the platform back together, it's apparent to me that this was a well-thought-out and complicated piece of engineering, with multiple layers all carefully cut and fitted together.
This is a pre-settlement phase, and yet you wouldn't expect it from Mesolithic people, from hunter-gatherers. It's just incredible to see it.
No, you thought they just ran around, broke twigs off and built lean-tos and killed the odd animal, but here they were building these complicated structures.
Proper carpentry.
Yeah, and very complicated, as we're finding out.
Despite what seemed to be an insurmountable challenge, we managed to piece back together the 8,000-year-old Mesolithic wooden platform.
That's it there.
Beautiful. There it is. Is this the first time it's all been together, reassembled since it came out of the sea?
Yeah, this is it. This is the most complete section we have. And it's, well, to me, it's really impressive. It may look like just loads of bits of wood, but really, I mean, this was made by someone 8,000 years ago, laid out for a purpose we don't know because we know very little about these people.
This is just one part of a massive set of platforms still lying underwater.
We can then start looking at some of the detail on some of the timbers and how they relate to each other. We can try and use that to help sort of interpret the building method.
The platform is a unique find that has advanced our understanding of our nomadic Mesolithic ancestors, clearly showing that they built permanent structures.
The intricacy of this whole platform, this whole structure, has actually been really surprising. The process of putting it back together has helped me to understand the process of how it must have been made, and it was so carefully, beautifully made. It's absolutely jaw-dropping.
Our next dig takes us to southern Dorset and the chance discovery of an extremely rare early Iron Age burial. The dig is taking place in a private cottage garden 8 miles from Dorchester. In 2013, builders were installing a new sewage pipe for a medieval cottage owned by the National Trust. Work came to a halt when they stumbled across some human bones. Archaeologist Dr. Martin Papworth was called in to investigate.
To find a JCB bucket full of bones is an extraordinary thing. Obviously, it doesn't happen every day, does it? And but it just raises lots of questions, doesn't it? I mean, how old are the bones? Is it one person? Is it several people? And why are they there?
A bone sample sent for radiocarbon testing indicated the burial dated from around 800 BC, the very early Iron Age. In the Iron Age, people were farming the land, living in roundhouses, building hill forts, and starting to use a new metal, iron, for tools and weapons. It's rare to find burials from this period. People may have been cremating the dead and scattering burned bone, or leaving bodies out in the open to decompose. It's taken Martin several years to raise the funds to excavate the site, and now he's back with a team of volunteers. He wants to investigate how the bodies were buried in order to understand the funeral practices of these Iron Age people. Already they're finding that the graves were carefully constructed.
They dug a pit, they've laid the burials or the bones in the pit, and then they've placed the stones over it and buried it. So the stones are the capping to the funeral remains.
Over the next few days, the stones are removed and the full scale of the burials is revealed. Martin has uncovered 3 skeletons. Their size suggests they could have been quite young.
So you have one skull there, another crushed skull here, and on the other side of the pipe trench, you've got another crushed skull here. Each one had a large stone above it. Over the years, as the flesh has rotted from these bodies, that the skulls have impacted and collapsed under the weight of the stones.
The archaeologists are finding something strange about the way the bodies were buried.
There's the skull, there's the teeth, there's the backbone, there's the shoulder, humerus running down through here, a series of ribs, but the whole thing has been caved back in and folded very, very sharply, and these are the 2 legs above the head with the toes of each foot, one above the other. So to get it in that sort of position, you'd have to tie the body up before you put it in the hole, because it's very hard to squeeze someone in that kind of tight angle.
It appears the bodies may have been buried in a tightly crouched position. While crouched burials like this have been found at Iron Age sites in Wales and Cornwall, for Martin, this is a first.
I've been working in Dorset for over 40 years now, and I've never come across anything like this or heard about it. We know that there are rituals where young people are put into the ground as part of a religion. But these people could have been dead some time before they were put in the ground, so that they could be trussed up in these positions. And it could have been a caring thing to do. It may be loving families, placing people in graves in a way they always do. Or it may be something more sinister, maybe something more brutal. All we can do is speculate.
With no grave goods accompanying the burials, the archaeologists are left with many unanswered questions. But they're also left feeling a deep connection with these ancestors.
You get a sense of these are people, and when you spend a day cleaning bones, you do feel rather sort of closer, and you wonder about them and how they interacted with this beautiful place that they lived here too, though 2,800 years ago.
With the dig drawing to a close, Martin and the team decide to leave the skeletons in their graves, just taking small bone samples for DNA analysis.
We never came here to take the bodies away from their resting place. We just came to take small samples to enable us, the scientists, to talk about the origins of these people. So they will remain here in the ground where we found them. The local people who live in the village have taken this place to heart, and they will look after them in the future.
I'm intrigued to find out more about these curious graves.
We don't have many burials from the early Iron Age.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? It's a very blank sort of period.
But this will be fascinating, because if there's good preservation of DNA, then you could sample the whole genome. I'm noticing the arm bone there, and the top of that humerus looks as though it's separate. Is that real?
It is, that's right, yes.
So that's a separate epiphysis,
yes.
Which means that bone is still growing.
Yes.
So this is a juvenile. This is
that's
not
right.
an adult.
No.
Yeah.
And they're all young.
Are they?
They're all teenagers.
Yeah.
Yes. We'd like to know why these three are together. So, are they related in any way? Are they brother and sister?
You know, with DNA, we should be able to at least start to answer these questions. It hasn't been possible to answer them before. Were there any signs of cause of death at all?
No, that wasn't seen.
So it's quite a strange burial.
They bound them when they buried them and trussed up as tightly as possible, legs and arms like this, perhaps wrapping them in something and then binding it tight and bringing the legs back up like that.
Looking at burial practices like this, it seems very odd to us today. But then, of course, this might be just perfectly normal burial practice, a respectful way to treat the dead.
It's a sort of window into a piece of the past we just don't understand, isn't
Yeah,
it? Which makes it fascinating.
Mudlarking is a practice which has been popular in London since at least the 18th century. People scoured the banks of the Thames looking for valuable trinkets or cargo that had fallen off passing ships. But archaeologists sometimes indulge in a spot of mudlarking as well, and our next excavation focuses on a huge artefact, 24 metres long, a submarine chaser from the First World War. The dig takes place on the banks of the River Thames in Isleworth on the outskirts of West London. A team from the Thames Discovery Programme are investigating a sorry-looking watercraft left to rot in thick mud behind a boatyard. But this wreck has a story to tell. It's the last known example of a First World War watercraft known as a motor launch.
As far as we know, there are no plans in existence for these things. So the only way we can find out how these things are actually built is by digging holes in the mud and trying to record it.
During the First World War, motor launches were part of the Royal Navy's answer to the looming threat of German submarine ambush. On the 7th of May 1915, the Lusitania was torpedoed with nearly 2,000 passengers on board. The ocean liner was ripped in two and sank in just 18 seconds. Over 1,000 people died in the attack. The Navy swiftly placed an order of motor launches with the Electric Launch Company based in America. These fast little boats were armed with depth charges, machine guns and a cannon, and would be sent out to patrol alongside British shipping.
They managed to knock out 550 of these in 488 days. And because the US was neutral at the time, they had to be part assembled in New York, put on railway wagons taken up to Canada for full assembly, and were then shipped across the Atlantic to serve in the North Sea, the Mediterranean and all around the European coast.
This specific craft was called ML-286. Post-war, she was retired from the military and converted into a houseboat. At some point, she was brought here to the boatyard to be patched up, but sadly the repairs proved too expensive, so she was abandoned and has been here ever since.
We've been here for 7 days, slowly trying to excavate out the middle of her and try and learn some of the constructional details of the vessel.
Each day, the team don't have much time on site. They must gather as much information as possible about this important little vessel before the tide turns. They take measurements and photographs and make drawings to create a detailed plan. But knee-deep in thick mud, this is a far harder task than the average dig.
But I think probably the most challenging aspect of it is it's by far the muddiest site we have, which can be fun. Everything gets covered in mud, but you've just got to embrace the mud. There's no point trying to not get dirty on this side.
All week I kept my feet pretty much dry. I've just filled my whole boot with water. Oh no.
When the order for the motor launches was placed, it was a challenge to deliver the fleet in such a short space of time. With foundries struggling to keep up with demand, even jeweller Tiffany's stepped in to supply brass. But despite the rich benefactors, the team are surprised at the construction.
These upper ribs, these are actually made of sort of really cheap plywood. They're actually held together by bits of ply, which no one knew. We knew they were cheap, we didn't know quite how cheap, but we're finding that out now.
After her duties in World War I, this plucky vessel also served in the Second World War, rescuing British soldiers as one of the little ships of Dunkirk. She was then retired and repurposed to be used as a houseboat on the Thames.
Just trying to piece together or tease out the different bits from the original to what was done when she was turned into a houseboat. People have the time to take and the money to spend, and so you start getting some of the original very cheap fittings, softwood fittings, replaced by this, which is hardwood.
Elsewhere in the hull, the team are uncovering further features.
See, our porthole opens! That's so exciting!
The capstan would have been on the bow of the ship for letting go the anchor and then winding it up again.
With the dig completely dictated by the tides, Elliot must run a tight ship and keep a close eye on the river.
It comes in very quickly. When you're downstream, you've got plenty of warning. Here upstream, you've got no indication. It's running out, and suddenly it's going the other way, and it's coming in quickly. So we've got to get out of the mud and across the river, or else we're camping here tonight.
The team now hope to use their photographs and drawings of this last remaining motor launch to create a detailed record of the structure of this historically important craft. Our next dig is back in Dorset, where archaeologists are investigating a Roman site. It was first dug in the late 1700s when stunning mosaics were found, but we know that they were dug up. We also know that very little attention was paid to what this building actually was, so many questions remain. The excavation is located just outside the village of Frampton, next to the River Frome. Archaeologist Dr. Miles Russell and his team from Bournemouth University are investigating the site. They want to find out about the people who lived here and, if possible, some clues about the relationship between these Romans and the wider local population.
It's a Roman building that's been known for some time, but it's one of a number of extremely late Roman luxury buildings that are occurring in Dorset in the 4th century AD.
This is a late Roman site dating to some 300 years after the invasion.
Up until this point, Roman activity in Dorset is fairly low-key. There's no real villas until we get to the 4th century, and suddenly they're everywhere. So the real question is, what is happening? Why does it take 250 to 300 years, and then there's a sudden explosion of wealth? These are starting to dominate the countryside.
It seems odd that the Romans didn't stamp their mark on Dorset until so late. Elsewhere in England, Romans were building lavish villas and ornate temples. They brought with them a Mediterranean style of architecture with painted plaster walls and elaborate mosaic floors. Back at the dig, Miles starts to uncover the footprint of the villa.
You can see where Harry's working down here. He's found this wall. It might be part of this sort of more extensive rooms coming through. That block of stone there, I think, might be part of a step or an entrance structure going up and into the corridor. So it's some kind of formal entranceway here. And then this is a slightly destroyed wall, and you can see we're coming into now mosaic. So this is some of the mosaic that Lyson's recorded in the 1790s. That is very nice. That is amazing. Right. Lovely. Absolutely incredible.
When the mosaics were first revealed in 1794, they were so impressive that King George III came to visit. but they were not preserved in situ and seem to have been taken away as souvenirs. Despite the fact the mosaics are mostly gone, there's still plenty of material on site that could reveal more about who was living here and their status in the community.
It's the rubbish that we're interested in, things that tells us about ordinary lives of people living in this site. So the sorts of things that were not saved during the 1790s dig. This was a large rectangular hollow tile that's built into the walls that conveys heating from under the floor and up through the walls themselves. So this is basically cavity wall heating. So to find these tiles means that we've got a heated room. It's pushing us towards the interpretation that this is the main entertainment space. So it's more information that just wasn't recorded in the 1790s.
Captured here on their dig diary camera, the team are also unearthing evidence that the outside of the villa was richly decorated. This carved sandstone finial would have sat on the apex of the roof.
Wow, that is gorgeous. Dave, I love you. Everything that we're finding from the box-through tiles, which suggests underfloor heating, from the wall plaster, and now also from the pottery and animal bone, it all fits a domestic context. It is a wealthy, high-status building up against the River Frome in quite an exotic and luxurious part of the Dorset landscape.
In amongst the rubble, Miles is also finding intriguing evidence of the people that lived here. One astonishing item even gives us a glimpse of their religious beliefs.
This is a coin of the Roman Emperor Magnentius in about 350 AD. We've got his face on one side, and he was very keen to advertise that he was a Christian emperor. So on the back of his coin, we've got the Chi-Rho symbol, the P and the X. The key thing about this, it's been pierced, so they've worn it around their neck.
The Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in 312 AD. With his backing, this religion slowly spread through the Roman world, reaching even the distant province of Britannia.
And it's a nice little individual find that gives us a little insight to the sorts of religions that were going on here. These are a new wealthy elite that's coming in from another part of the empire, and they're building their luxury houses here, and they're bringing their exotic Eastern faith with them. And it's coins like this that give us that indicator of that sort of personalised aspect of this new religious belief system.
But this opulent villa and its Christian Roman occupants are only a small part of the story of Dorset at this time. At another site, not far from the villa, Miles is also finding evidence of the people who lived in the wider landscape here. These people belong to a tribe called the WWII. The WWII were one of a number of tribes in southwest Britain at the time of the Roman invasion and occupation. The land of the WWII seems to have centred on Dorset, with parts of southern Wiltshire and Somerset as well. But very little is known about their relationship with the Roman Empire. The artefacts Miles has unearthed give us a glimpse into the lives of these people.
The WWII, the local tribe, are constantly recycling, reusing, and making sure that everything has a purpose. So this is actually carved out of a sheep bone. You can see it's a comb. Other things that we get from native sites around here, we get lots of spindle whorls. So these are sort of the weights at the end of a spindle during the weaving process. We get no real idea of the range of materials they were wearing. The only real dress indicators that we get are often like this little bronze pins or brooches. This is much like a modern day safety pin.
It seems that the WWII lived peacefully alongside the Roman settlers, but these artefacts appear to show the WWII maintained a strong sense of their own identity.
This is probably a wine vessel or possibly an alcohol, sort of a beer or mead cup. It's completely unlike anything that the Roman world is producing. People are using ceramic styles that aren't linked to the Roman Empire. They're using things that are more native design, and they're not high on status symbols.
So despite some Romans building lavish villas in Dorset, Roman culture didn't seem to seep out into the wider countryside.
As far as we can see, the locals here, the WWII tribe, didn't embrace Roman culture at all. They don't seem to be impressed by or want to be part of that Roman system. They don't seem to want to be Roman.
I've asked Miles to bring in some of those fascinating finds for closer analysis.
So you've got this pattern where you've got very different material culture in the villa compared with sites in the surrounding countryside. What does this tell us about the people of Dorset and how they engaged with being part of the Roman Empire?
I don't think really sort of engaging with it at all. Whereas in the east we can see Roman villas, we can see Roman culture, right the way down to native settlements. We've got high status Roman pottery and so on. There's none of that filtering down to the natives here in Dorset.
It's fascinating because it shows us how dangerous it is to look at a scenario in one part of our country and then extrapolate that across the whole nation.
They are existing within the Roman world, but for whatever reason they're not choosing to be Roman.
So what are these objects?
So we've got a range which are all native. We've got sort of combs, we've got spindle whorls. There's a whole range of craft activities.
So are these brooches not Roman then?
No, they're not.
Is that more of a kind of native British
It is,
design?
yes. I mean, we see these really from about 80 BC onwards. We see them going right the way through the Roman period, but it is not something that is Roman at all. It's not influenced by the Roman world whatsoever.
That's fascinating. So you're seeing a completely different culture.
Yes, I mean, the Roman
version.
fibulae are far more decorated, far more sort of squared and really sort of quite chunky status items. These are quite small in comparison.
And then this little bowl, I mean, this is beautiful, but this is very much a British form.
Yes, so that's black burnish ware. It's very highly polished. It's made in southern Dorset right the way up until the 4th century AD. And again, you've got that sort of diamond X-shaped design around the outside.
And it's got this inbuilt strainer on it.
Brilliant, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yes.
I really like it. It's beautifully made. And then look at that crazy
swirls.
design on the base.
These are all individual, unique items, so they've got their own personality to them.
These people clearly thought of themselves as being the people of Dorset.
Exactly, and there's no real desire to be Roman. They're paying their tax, they're living within that system, but they're not choosing to become Roman in any shape or form.
They're not adopting that identity.
No.
So even when you've got villas appearing in the countryside in Dorset, they seem to be capsules of Roman culture. It's not seeping out.
No, it's a little sort of cultural bubble. I think the wealthy are living in their house with their own estate, but their culture's not seeping out to the wider world, and neither is the native stuff coming in. So they are very much sort of excluded between these two separate worlds. There's a sort of almost like a cultural apartheid going on there between these two different cultures.
We know that the Romans and Greeks loved putting on plays, but it wasn't until the 16th century that theatre as we know it really took off in Britain. And the focus of the drama was London, where raucous comedies and historical tragedies were performed in the open air. For our next dig, Nisha McSweeney joins a team from MOLA, Museum of London Archeology, as they excavate an Elizabethan playhouse.
The dig takes place in Whitechapel, the bustling heart of London's East End. The impending construction of a new student accommodation block has opened up an exciting archaeological possibility. Records suggest that this was the location of a long-lost open-air theatre, built in the back garden of a popular Elizabethan inn known as the Boar's Head. MOLA were commissioned to investigate.
We're here to see the remains of the Boar's Head Playhouse. We don't know much about it. It's not a Shakespearean playhouse, but we think it was a thriving theatre.
Records reveal that the Boar's Head Playhouse dates from the 16th and 17th century to the time of Queen Elizabeth I. Senior archaeologist Heather Knight is showing me around the site.
Where we're standing now is at the back of what would have been the Boar's Head Playhouse. The stage was under where our machine is now. The tiring house would have been just slightly outside of the site.
What's the tiring house?
The tiring house is like the changing rooms where the actors put on their attire.
And where was the inn, the old inn?
The inn
where
itself
would that
would have actually fronted the road, which is Whitechapel High Street, So right down the far side of the site would have been the inn.
Playhouses were at their peak during the 1600s and were sometimes attached to pubs. The theatre at the Boar's Head was one of the earliest known in London. There are records of performances taking place in the pub's backyard, but it wasn't until 1598 that a purpose-built stage was constructed. Digging down some 3 metres below modern street level, the team finally arrived at the site of the pub.
So what we do, we start taking off the top levels using a big machine, and then slowly as we come down we can see from the finds within those layers that we're going back through time, and then when we get back to the 18th century layers we then go to hand digging, and then we work our way down into the 17th century that way.
So can you tell me what we've got here then?
And we're actually standing within the foundations for a building that was part of the Boar's Head Playhouse. So you can stand here looking at actors performing on the stage in front of you.
This rectangular playhouse makes this site distinct from other Elizabethan theatres, which were more commonly built as rounded, enclosed structures. For example, Shakespeare's Globe, which was built 2 years after the Boar's Head Playhouse.
I think the spotlight has been more on Bankside because of the associations with Shakespeare. And I think that's part of the reason the Boar's Head might have slipped off people's radar slightly. It's been overlooked a little bit. So, yeah, this is its chance to shine.
For a small fee of 1 or 2 pennies, audiences could enjoy a whole afternoon of entertainment. The combination of performance and beer made for a high-spirited crowd.
I'm looking at some of the plays that were performed here when it was a proper playhouse. They're kind of city plays. They would have really appealed to a city audience. They're kind of scandalous and lampooning public figures. You know, they do push the boundaries a little bit, yeah.
But as the more puritanical mid-17th century approached, there was little tolerance of drunken crowds enjoying raucous satire. At the start of the Civil War in 1642, most of London's playhouses shut down. With closure on the horizon, the Boar's Head landowner saw a development opportunity. The site was split into small plots and sold off. The team have found evidence of what happened next.
Where we're standing now is after the Boar's Head has gone out of use. And this end of the site, we're finding a lot of clay pipe making.
Okay.
And also a lot of pipe clay.
Is this actual pipe clay?
This is actual pipe clay, and it's still really squishy.
So they're using this to make, what kind of pipes? What?
Very
tiny.
It is tiny, and by the shape of the bowl, we know this is 17th century.
What other things were they making around in this industrial area, apart from lots and lots of pipe?
We're also finding evidence for horn working. So you take the useful part of an animal horn, which is that outside coating, it's a bit like your fingernails, and you can kind of peel it and stretch it, and you can make lantern panes because it's translucent. You can also make things like, you know, drinking cups and spoons, and the covers for horn books. So Middlesex Street in the 17th century really does seem to be the epicentre of horn working in London.
After the end of this kind of theatrical period in the site, it then becomes a kind of commercial centre.
It is really industrial, and it's kind of the industries you wouldn't maybe want to live next door to. You know, if you've got pipe kilns, you've got people boiling up animal horns.
Smelly,
smoky. Yeah, maybe that's why it's happening on the east side of the city.
As London grew, factories and other manufacturing sites tended to be built on London's east side. It's thought that they were built here to make use of the prevailing westerly winds. This would mean that the smoke and pungent odours were blown away from the city centre.
So what are our finds that we have from the Boar's Head itself?
Well, amongst our sort of selection of finds on the table, the things that are really kind of obviously Boar's Head are beer mugs. These beautifully black glaze 17th century ceramics. They kind of, originally it would have been quite tall, maybe with another handle. And we're finding lots of those.
So, but what about the industrial installations?
We were talking about horn working, and we obviously get the waste product, which is the inside of the animal horn. These just get thrown away because they have no use for those. The big thing we have going on is clay tobacco pipe making. We have wasters, the ones that have failed the process, and so they've not been smoked really clean on the inside. But on the table here we've got part of that actual kiln fabric. So you can see it's really vitrified from the heat of the kiln, and you can actually see how they've used clay pipes within the fabric of the kiln. It's almost like clay wattle and daub, really. It kind of gives the clay some rigidity in the structure.
To celebrate the site's connection with the city's theatrical heritage, the exposed Elizabethan playhouse will be preserved in situ and incorporated as part of the new development.
We first arrived this morning, I thought it was a hole in the ground. Had no idea what we were going to find at the bottom of it. This kind of politically charged, irreverent kind of theatre scene where people are out there with their beer mugs. I think that's really exciting to get a feel of it here. After the end of the theatrical phase, you have this industrial centre, this thriving hub of manufacture. And the small finds from this site really bring the place to life for me, right? You've got the tobacco pipes, hundreds of them, the kind of smoky tobacco, and you've got these beer mugs after beer mugs. This must have been such a raucous pace. It's kind of 16th century EastEnders.
For our final dig, we're revisiting an excavation first filmed by Digging for Britain in 2017. Back then, MOD archaeologists were called in to investigate a small island in Portsmouth Harbour where human bones were eroding out of a cliff. The team discovered 4 sets of human remains, including a skull that had been sawn open.
Got a craniotomy here, so you can see this cut through the skull.
This year, MOD archaeologist Richard Osgood is back because storms have eroded the cliff face, causing more bones to emerge.
We've got at the moment, I think, 3 or 4 areas of interest that are human remains, and we've got only about 3 or 4 days to get them out.
The dig takes place on Burrow Island, which lies just opposite Portsmouth Historic Dockyard. Richard's filming his dig diary with members of Operation Nightingale. This is a military initiative using archaeology to help the recovery of service personnel injured in conflict.
So here we've got tibia and a fibula just coming in, going into the side of the cliff there.
That's one lower leg, is it?
Yes,
Is there
that's
just
right.
one that you can see at the moment?
We think we've got the second one just coming through here.
The burials are believed to date from the early 1800s, the late Georgian era. At this time, floating jails called prison hulks were moored in the nearby harbour. These were home to convicts and prisoners of war. The author Charles Dickens grew up in Portsmouth and he knew about these prison ships. It's believed the inmates could have inspired the character of Abel Magwitch, the escaped convict in Great Expectations. Back at the dig, artefacts are emerging that help confirm the date of the graves.
One of the burials, which had just a few bones within it, also produced this really lovely pipe bowl. This is really a date of about early 19th century. It's a good fix for what we're doing on the site.
But as the dig continues, the team make an unsettling discovery. They're finding more graves extending right up the cliff face, far higher than originally recorded.
We're cleaning up the cliff, and perhaps that was an error because when we've cleaned up the face, there are even more coffins that are being exposed.
This is a new revelation. The burials are stacked one on top of another. The large number of graves suggests that the island was being used as a burial site over many years, longer than previously thought.
So you've got a nice clear coffin that's cutting through this area of the site, but you've got bones either side of it. And what that shows is they've come across an earlier burial and dug it out to put the new coffin in. So this set of human remains is an earlier burial, at least 2 phases of burial here, and it just shows the sheer level of activity of burial on the island.
With the dig coming to a close, the bones are taken away for further analysis. But the plan is that in the future, all the skeletons will be reburied on the island, but on the top, safely away from the eroding cliff edges. I've asked Richard to bring in some of the human remains recovered this year, including one very unusual find.
It's one of the coffins that we saw this year. Actually, there were some other bones that were found as part of that assemblage.
We're still looking at human bones here, but absolutely minute human bones, so an infant. Is that unusual? Have you found any infant remains before on Ross Island?
This is the first time we found something like this, and in many ways that changes our understanding, maybe our picture of what's going on. Does it mean that there's a female convict who went on whilst pregnant, gave birth, and the infant died? Was she incarcerated with an infant? I don't know, but it changes our whole narrative of the site because it's so much younger than anything else.
It's very sad to think about. If it is a female convict with her baby on board one of those prison hulks, it must have been a horrendous place to be. So these are skeletons that have just emerged this year, and there's quite a bit more work still to do on them. But you've been able to advance some of that process with skeletons that have emerged in previous years.
That's right. And I've brought one of them in.
I've seen this one before.
You have seen this one before, but we've got a lot more about this man's story from when he was here last. He's been subjected to some fairly rudimentary early autopsy work.
Yeah.
We've been able to get a company to do a facial reconstruction of him, and you've got it there.
You've brought that along, haven't you? We can see him there. And then if we put the flesh back on the bones, that's what he might have looked like. It's quite strange, isn't it, to see, a face brought back to life in that way.
It's astonishing. It's so realistic, isn't it?
It's quite haunting.
I'd like to think he'd be pleased that we remembered his story and are still telling a bit more about him some 200 years after his demise.
The south of Britain has yielded up a rich diversity of archaeological finds spanning 10,000 years of history. We've travelled back to an ancient Stone Age settlement, marvelled at a Roman trading post, and trodden the boards of an Elizabethan theatre. The United Kingdom has an epic history and a wealth of secrets still to uncover. Every year, hundreds of archaeologists dig, dive, and sieve to find clues to add to the great historical jigsaw of our ancestors' lives.
You know when people say, what's the best thing you've ever found, guys? This.
I'm Professor Alice Roberts.
This year we've uncovered some astonishing finds and made some truly groundbreaking discoveries.
Wow, look at that.
Each team of archaeologists has been armed with a dig diary camera so they can record their discoveries as they happen.
That is brilliant. Dave, I love you.
Our roving archaeologist, Dr. Nisha McSweeney, is out on the digs.
Who are we looking at?
It's royal.
I will be inviting the teams to bring in their finds for closer analysis.
That is absolutely beautiful.
In this episode, we're in the north of the British Isles.
The north of Britain is stuffed full of history and archaeology, from Neolithic settlements on Orkney to Hadrian's Wall, from a Viking capital in York to a king buried in a Leicester car park. And I'm here on the banks of Loch Ness, close to Culloden, the site of the last great battle of the Jacobite Rebellion in 1745.
We'll join digs right across the north as archaeologists search for a long-lost Viking drinking hall, discover Roman treasure hidden in an Anglo-Saxon cemetery, and reveal evidence of our ancestors' deepest fears.
Welcome to Digging for Britain.
Our first dig takes us to the childhood home of Britain's shortest reigning monarch. She was a first cousin of Henry VIII's son, Edward VI, and she was on the English throne in 1553 from the 10th to the 19th of July. She's known as the 9 Days Queen, Lady Jane Grey. In the Leicestershire countryside lies Bradgate Park. 850 acres of stunning, rugged landscape. This ancient estate was the family seat of Britain's often forgotten monarch, Lady Jane Grey, who's believed to have lived here as a child. Professor Richard Thomas and his team from Leicester University are excavating within what remains of the estate's main building, Bradgate House. This is thought to have been one of the first unfortified aristocratic houses in England, dating back to the early 16th century. Richard is looking for evidence that could support that early date and the long-held theory that this was indeed the childhood home of Lady Jane.
Very little information about Bradgate House, both in terms of the written record and in terms of images, but we know next to nothing about the house as it looked in the 16th century.
Lady Jane was born in 1536. The great niece of King Henry VIII, she was raised as a devout Protestant. Before Henry's son, King Edward VI, died, he declared that his first cousin, Lady Jane, should succeed him. She was proclaimed queen at just 16. But England was in the middle of a power struggle.
There was a lot of turmoil over different religious sides. So Henry VIII sets up the Church of England, but there's still quite a strong Catholic following in England at the time. So there's a lot of tension between the two sides, if you like.
Lady Jane's aunt, Mary Tudor, was a Catholic, and Mary's followers were determined to see her on the throne. Just 9 days after Lady Jane was declared queen, she was deposed, locked up in the Tower of London, and eventually executed. At the dig, the team have made an unexpected discovery. It looks like the large upstanding brick building was constructed over something older.
I'm standing at the moment inside a room, and inside that room we've got this other brick structure that's over on my left-hand side, and it's got a tiled surface behind me. And what this is a fireplace, and we can tell that because we've got fire-cracked tiles that belong to the hearth. It's beginning to look a little bit like a kitchen structure.
But as they excavate further, they realise it's not just a kitchen. It's the foundations of another entire house, predating the larger brick building, which has always been assumed to be Lady Jane's home.
What do you think this structure is?
Well, potentially this might be a garderobe, which is the medieval word for a toilet.
Garderobes were the luxury loos of the Tudor era. A room with a seat connected to a shaft that dropped waste into a moat or drain below. Only the wealthiest households had one.
After getting all the rubble out, we have found 600-year-old excrement and so forth.
Does it smell?
It does. It has a strange smell that you can't really compare to anything else. That is a bloody big drain.
The team want to pin down the date of this mystery building. As the days pass, they discover tantalising traces of the people who lived here, including what they ate.
From our excavations, we can work out what kind of animal it's come from, so things like peacocks, some marine fish, and some other exotic animals. And of course, because we're in the middle of a deer park, we know that they are eating quite a lot of venison. We've got quite high status living here.
The team also find evidence that this was a religious household.
So I think one of my favourites has been this. It's got a decoration on that appears to be Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. And then you've got the apple tree, and then you've got you can see the snake curling around the trunk of the tree.
Known as a pilgrim badge, tokens like this often depicted biblical stories or saints and were worn by the devout. This land was owned by the Grey family long before Lady Jane was born, but it's not yet clear which generation of Greys lived in this earlier structure. The team are looking for clues to show exactly when this older building was in use. And halfway through the dig, they have a breakthrough.
This morning when we were clearing away some of the demolition layer in this area, however, we uncovered a sovereign penny, minted during the reign of Henry VIII. So we don't know the exact date of minting, but somewhere between 1509 and 1547. That's important because that gives us a date somewhere in the sort of early to mid 16th century. We can say with some degree of confidence that these walls came down sometime in the first half of the 16th century.
This tiny coin suggests the older building was in use when Lady Jane was a child. Richard now believes that these older foundations, not the upstanding ruins, are what's left of the childhood home of England's 9 Days Queen. I've asked Richard to come and explain more about this exciting new revelation.
So where's that kind of mythology come from then, that what you see above ground was her house?
We've got historical records that tell us that the standing room is where she spent her childhood. And we'd always assumed that this traditional narrative that the standing room, you see the brick structure, was her house. So when we started the project, we had absolutely no idea that we would be discovering an earlier house and that the upstanding structure would turn out to be later. So it was completely unexpected.
So you've got some of the finds here. How do those relate to this building?
Yeah, so we knew we had this earlier building, but what we really needed is something that gives us an absolute date for when it was in use. And the coins have been really, really helpful in helping us to determine those dates. And this is a coin, silver coin that was minted at the Tower of London, and it was minted somewhere between 1544 and 1547. You know, she was born in 1536, so potentially she's 8 years old, running around Bradgate House at the time this coin is dropped on this floor surface, and then it becomes sealed by another floor surface later on.
So we're getting this glimpse of a moment where there's this little girl running around in the house. Yeah. Her great-uncle is on these coins, and she has got no conception at all that she will eventually end up on the throne.
Absolutely none whatsoever.
What else have we got here? Some objects that tell us a little bit about everyday life in the house, perhaps?
Yeah, this is a small fragment of a hand-painted jug. And the jug will have come from the Netherlands, so it's what we call a tin glaze. It's commonly known as Mallorca ware. But what's nice is it's a very small fragment, but it's got a motif of the Passion of the Christ. So...
Hang on a minute. There's a pillar with a spiral and then a sort of a fan-like arrangement over here. How do you know that this is meant to be something about the crucifixion?
So, yeah, thankfully we've got complete vessels where we can actually see what the entire picture looks like. But what we've got here is this pillar. That is the pillar where Jesus was whipped. And then we can see the fan you're referring to, that is the whip. And again, it's telling us lots of different stories. It's telling us about trade connections, it's telling us about their status, to be able to afford these, you know, luxury imports. But it's also telling us, again, about that centrality of religion to daily life.
And what about Lady Jane Grey herself? Do we know where she ended up? Where was she buried?
Because she was of royal descent, she gets executed at the Tower of London. And so her body, she's supposed to be buried in one of the chapels at the Tower. So, of course, all sorts of local legends that the body was spirited back to Bradgate and was reburied, but we have no expectation that was the case.
And why do we not call her Queen Jane?
Yeah, it's really interesting why she's still Lady Jane Grey. The reason is because she although she was proclaimed Queen, she never had a coronation. So it's effectively a technicality that we don't call her Queen Jane.
It's just extraordinary, isn't it? She had no idea when she was a little girl that she would end up sitting on the throne, and then she's on the throne for 9 days, and that is effectively a death sentence.
Yeah, at age 16.
Yeah.
It's a real tragic story.
Now we travel to Northern Ireland, where archaeologists have discovered the cemetery of a Victorian workhouse.
Now, the 19th century was a pivotal time in Irish history, a time of great hardship for many, where poverty and disease were made even worse by the Great Famine. Our roving archaeologist Nisha McSweeney joined the excavation.
I've come to the small county downtown of Downpatrick, where archaeologists are excavating on the site of a Victorian workhouse built in 1842. By the mid-19th century, there were almost 2,000 workhouses across the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. They were designed to house and feed the poor in exchange for hard, physical labour. In Downpatrick, the land connected to the poorhouse is now needed for access to a new school. But the site contains the workhouse's cemetery, so a specialist archaeological team has been brought in to excavate and document the burials before they can be carefully reinterred nearby. I'm with osteoarchaeologist Bethany Johnson to find out what she's discovered about the people who died here.
These are people from the workhouse. Is there anything we can tell about the bones at this stage?
As we're taking the bones out, it has become quite obvious that, forgetting how they're actually being preserved in the ground, they're not as robust as you would like. These people were malnourished. The bones sort of reflect that.
The poor in Ireland relied almost solely on the potato to survive. In 1845, an aggressive plant pathogen known as the blight decimated crops throughout the country. This was the beginning of the Great Famine. The potato blight stretched workhouses like these to the limits.
The diet would have been quite limited, really, and they probably weren't actually meeting their calorific needs.
Documenting all the individuals buried here has been especially difficult because many of their remains had been found mixed together.
So, Bethany, can you just tell us what we've got here?
Here we have an exposed grave cut with at least 2 individuals. So you can see we've got 2 skulls at the top end here, one lying on top of the other, and then we have the rest of the bodies basically intermingling.
So were these 2 buried in a single grave?
What's happening is the coffins are actually collapsing in on top of each other.
So 2 coffins stacked on one another,
Exactly.
The wood rots, and then the skeletons
fall through.
Actually, they've been buried with dignity. Somebody's made the effort.
They
to
are,
put them in
exactly.
coffins.
And it would have been really important for the people that they knew that they were actually going to be buried in a coffin.
So what's the maximum depth that they've been stacked?
Just in the far corner here, I think we had 8 individuals.
8?
Yes.
The highest stacks show that at a certain point, the death rate accelerated rapidly, beyond even famine levels. The cause was known as famine fever. In 1847, just 2 years after the famine struck, a deadly combination of relapsing fever and typhus ripped through Downpatrick and the workhouse.
Head archaeologist Chris Lynn understands how devastating the combination of famine and fever was. What kind of impact did it have on the workhouse?
The workhouse was really constructed for a population of 500.
Right.
But during the famine, it increased to 1,000. And because of the fever, there's like a sudden collapse of the population of the workhouse.
Right.
So people were dying, and then the population of the workhouse more or less instantly filled back up again because of the famine.
By 1849, just 7 years after this workhouse opened, 1 million Irish men, women and children had died. A further 2 million fled the country, many seeking refuge in America.
So this site for me has been a real eye-opener. We're only 150 years apart, and I'm sitting here, I'm only separated by a few generations from the person. And that has made this very immediate experience for me. It's all the more so because part of my family is Irish, my father's Irish, so this feels like I'm sitting here excavating a bit of my own history.
The team estimate there are close to 400 burials in this single cemetery. It will take them more than a year to carefully exhume, document and reinter the remains. But what they reveal stands as a shocking reminder of the devastation that poverty, famine and fever wreaked on this community in such a short period of history.
Our next dig is a very old site with a modern twist. Archaeology is a detective story. We're looking for clues, piecing them together, trying to understand past events, working out what those societies were like, getting inside our ancestors' minds. Sometimes the clues are hidden in plain sight and it just takes a keen eye to recognise them. Our next story takes us back into the depths of prehistory, but then collides with a much more recent tale of superstition, witches, and the occult. The dig is taking place at Creswell Crags, located on the border of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. It's a limestone gorge riddled with caves that have been studied by archaeologists for over a century. Those investigations revealed evidence of human activity here, dating back more than 10,000 years. Back in Series 1 of Digging for Britain, I visited Creswell to study their spectacular Ice Age cave art. Today, a small team of archaeologists from the University of Sheffield are conducting a new investigation into a more recent period of history here. They are digging outside the caves, where a medieval village once stood.
We're looking in a non-cave context because nobody's excavated outside the caves yet. We know from maps that there were some structures at the east end of the gorge, and they were there until early 19th century.
And there was a fairly obvious hint that there might be a building here in the form of that arch there. So we put our trench here. We thought that we might get part of the a bit of the post-medieval settlement, and who knows, if we can get down far enough, maybe even some earlier stuff.
So by conducting an archaeological excavation there, we might find some material that gives us some insight into the people who lived here.
The village was occupied from medieval times right up to the 18th century, but the team's initial finds date from much earlier.
This is a flint blade tool, or a flake. It looks to be a Neolithic blade, or a Neolithic flake, if you like, which is interesting because it's much older than what we thought we were going to find in that structure. It's a reminder that the archaeology here at Creswell spans this immense period of time.
Most of what we know about Creswell comes from the work of amateur archaeologist Albert Leslie Armstrong, who led a series of digs in the 1920s and 30s.
Armstrong is famous and notorious. He was an early archaeologist that was very interested in the Paleolithic in Britain, and he pretty much identified the Paleolithic in Britain. The bad thing is that the techniques for excavation at that time were picks and shovels and wheelbarrows, and not the kind of control that we like these days.
Unfortunately for the team, their finds tell them less about the lives of the 18th century villagers and more about Armstrong's early 20th century methods.
The first one we found was this bottle cap, which actually has a date on it, which says 1933 on it. And obviously Armstrong's dig was in the 1930s. And over here is a George V coin. Obviously George V died in 1936. So this, again, fits perfectly with Armstrong's dig.
The reason for this renewed interest in the lives of these villagers at Creswell is thanks to an incredible revelation announced in early 2019 about something that had been right under Armstrong's nose all along. The walls of the caves at Creswell Crags are covered in strange marks, scratched into the rock.
There are literally hundreds of marks scarring the wall all the way around. There's hardly a small space of clear rock that you could put another one on.
For generations, archaeologists have just assumed that these marks were graffiti, unworthy of serious attention.
We knew that there was a lot of graffiti in the caves, but what people hadn't realised that hiding between these marks, there were these single marks that are the most pertinent ones.
But in 2019, a pair of amateur symbologists happened to visit the site. They realised the significance of these markings, recognising them as witches' marks.
we realised that they were quite important because there were so many of them and they were in such a concentration in one particular place. So we knew there was a story to be told here.
Witches' marks, or apotropaic marks, from the Greek meaning to turn away, were used by fearful locals to ward off evil spirits.
King James wrote a treatise called Demonology, which set out ways in which witches could be feared and witches could be seen and found and how they infiltrated houses.
James I believed that witches existed and were responsible for many of society's ills. His 1597 treatise on demonology described different sorts of demons and witches, and he was personally involved in witchcraft trials. A belief in witches persisted right up to the 19th century.
The most common mark at Creswell is the conjoined V, which refers to the cult of the Virgin and the Virgin Mary. We sometimes find marks of Christ's name. One that we find is the IX, and this is known from other cave contexts and from churches and buildings as well.
We've also got a 1718 and a 1717, which is right in the middle of the period that we think that these probably date to. And further down the tunnel on the right-hand side, we've got possibly our oldest date of all, which is 1505.
The dates place the marks within the time frame of the village, and they're particularly concentrated in one area of the cave.
What we've got here is what some of the press have christened the gateway to hell, and there's a gaping chasm in the middle of this chamber here, which has got to be 12 to 15 feet deep. There may have been a draft blowing through that hole, and evil spirits are meant to follow flows of air, so it could have been that was concerning them. Maybe there's been some infant mortality, cows aren't producing enough milk, which you might think is down to an evil influence, and that you might want to do something about that and drive that evil into the furthest reaches of the darkest part of this cave in order to trap it there.
It turns out that the most compelling evidence of the villagers themselves has been hiding in plain sight, inside the caves, all along.
We haven't yet found anything that which ties it into the witches' marks, but we haven't finished yet. We're still going down.
The excavation of the village is only in its early stages, but the real revelation this year has been the discovery of these witches' marks, a rare glimpse of the beliefs and superstitions of the villagers who once lived here.
The Anglo-Saxon period in English history dawns after the collapse of the Roman Empire and lasts right up to the Norman conquest. We learn a lot about the Anglo-Saxons from their burials, in particular the grave goods. We learn about the clothes people wore, the objects that they found precious, and the way that they constructed their identities. Now a dig in Lincoln is focusing on Anglo-Saxon death in order to shed light on those past lives.
This site is on a farm not far from the Lincolnshire coast, just outside the tiny village of Scremby. First discovered by a local metal detectorist, it's a hilltop cemetery containing almost 100 graves dating back to the early Anglo-Saxon period in the 6th century AD. Digging for Britain first visited the site last year, when Dr. Hugh Wilmot and his team from the University of Sheffield were starting to excavate the site, which was threatened with damage from agricultural vehicles. They discovered an extraordinary proportion of high-status burials containing precious and exotic grave goods, like these ivory rings, which may have been imported from Africa.
This site dates from the migration period in the sort of late 5th, early 6th century. And this is a period when you're starting to get Anglo-Saxon migrations appearing into eastern England and then moving into central England after the end of the Roman Empire.
Thankfully, the team continued filming their dig diaries after our visit last season. One piece they later uncovered proved to be incredibly rare.
Oh, beautiful. It's completely different.
A spectacularly well-preserved bronze and enamel bowl. The team have returned this year to complete the dig.
This is the trench we're excavating this summer, and there are burials right the way across it.
They're continuing to find an astonishing array of grave goods, catching their discoveries on their dig diary cameras.
Well, earlier on, we started excavating this burial and a bit of iron came up and we weren't sure what it was, but now it's been fully exposed and it's really rather exciting. It's an Anglo-Saxon sea axe, which is kind of like a dagger, so it's bigger than a knife but smaller than a sword. I'm just going to lift the sea axe.
Iron weapons are often found in male Anglo-Saxon graves, perhaps suggesting warrior status.
Round of applause.
It's an important find, as there have been so few intact male burials at this site.
The females are sort of buried on their sides, often in a crouched position, and have to be dug a bit deeper in. The males are buried a bit shallower, lying on their backs and extended, and you don't need a very deep hole for that. You know, farmers don't know they're there, and they often get just totally wiped out when ploughing takes place.
We don't know why men and women were buried at different depths, but it means that many deeper female burials have survived completely intact.
Well, we've just started lifting one of the necklaces on one of the females there, and one of the fine beads that's come up is this rock crystal one. It's obviously a naturally occurring mineral, and it's extremely hard, and it's been polished and smoothed into this really super bead that looks like it was made yesterday. And they're not that common a find.
But not all the finds are simply decorative.
Oh, wow, how's it going here? What have we got?
We've kind of got an indication that there might be a girdle hanger around here, but we're not quite sure yet.
Girdle hangers were worn at the waist and often shaped like keys. Scholars believe that they represent an important symbol of female identity, possibly relating to a role as head of a household or even a landowner. Women had comparatively high status in Anglo-Saxon society, with legal rights, including the right to own land and the right to leave their husbands. Midway through the season, the team's dig cameras catch a once-in-a-lifetime find in another female grave.
It's a silver bracelet. It's got sort of incised design on it, and it's right on the surface of the grave. So, you know, it's a really terrific find. It's a really, really special, rare object. This is the first one like this we found here, and there's probably only about less than half a dozen other ones that have been found nationally, and usually they're associated with individuals thought to be of really quite high status.
This season has been even more fruitful than last year.
We've done 2 seasons of work now, and I think we've learned pretty much as we're going to.
The quantity of rare finds in this ancient Lincolnshire cemetery suggests it was reserved for the most high-ranking people in this Anglo-Saxon community.
Here you've been back at Scremby again, and you've had some amazing finds coming out of the cemetery.
We have.
Some quite characteristic Anglo-Saxon finds, but some unusual ones as well. This astonishing pole, I mean, that is absolutely beautiful. Is this an object which has any parallels elsewhere?
Well, this is a super object in its own right.
Yeah.
And it's even more exciting in the context it's in. So it's actually Roman. It probably dates to the 2nd century AD.
Really?
Yep. And it belongs to a group, there's about half a dozen similar vessels to this that are known from Roman Britain.
Yeah.
So it's a really rare object as a Roman vessel.
Yeah.
But then it's found buried 400 years after it's made in an Anglo-Saxon grave.
It was an antique.
Oh, absolutely.
So what's it made of? Is it bronze?
Yep, it's cast in bronze, and then this decoration is actually chased out with a sharp tool.
Right, OK.
And then it's infilled with enamelling. If you imagine that new shiny bronze with colours, you've got red, you've got green, you've got blue.
It would have been I mean, it is a gorgeous object now. It would have been absolutely bright and stunning, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. What have we got here then? What's that extraordinary thing?
Oh, this is really super. This is a little boar's head mount. You can see the tusks and the teeth there, and it's got these little garnet eyes.
So those garnets are looking a bit dull now, but they would have been bright red, wouldn't they?
We're not entirely sure what it is, but one possibility is it's possibly a mount of a helmet.
Right.
There's a bit of an association between the boar imagery and Anglo-Saxon helmets.
That is stunning. Now that brings me to this extraordinary bracelet. Absolutely beautiful. Wow.
Well, this is one of our star finds. It's not often you kind of find sort of large sort of silver objects in Anglo-Saxon burials, and
Can I pick it up? Is it too fragile?
No, it's remarkably stable. I mean, it's almost as if it's been made yesterday.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very, very rare object. There's probably about a dozen of them known from cemeteries across the country.
Yeah.
And most of those come from antiquarian excavations, so it's really nice to have one from a modern excavation.
And the ones that are known, are they of a similar style to this?
There are two broad styles. One's like this, which are sort of flat strips of silver that are just sort of wrapped around, and tend to be heavier and have a sort of higher content of silver. And then you get another type where they're sort of crinkle cut, sort of thinner and sort of fluted. And they seem to have a sort of distinct regional variation.
And what about this pattern? Is that a kind of known pattern?
It's a really interesting pattern. Again, they tend to be decorated like this with this sort of punched decoration.
Yeah.
But this is the only one that has almost like a sort of stylized beast head or flower head at the end.
Yeah.
And the only other parallel I know of is actually on a piece of gold work from the Staffordshire Hoard.
Really?
There's a sort of gold strip that has a similar kind of decoration on the end.
And do you think the objects that they're buried with are sort of everyday objects, or are these objects specifically for the grave?
It's difficult to tell that, but I think most of these objects were actually things they were using all the time. So the beads, for instance, are often worn and, slightly chipped. Perhaps some of the objects, like the silver bracelet, seem in remarkably good condition, so perhaps they were specifically put in for the burial.
What's your understanding of the cemetery now that you've more fully excavated it?
Well, what's been really interesting is that although it's been quite damaged by ploughing, we've managed to excavate pretty much 100% of the cemetery. We've got about 50 intact burials. That's probably about half of what there would have been originally. So it's one of these small little cemeteries that seems to come into use in the 6th century and then goes out of use by the middle of that century.
What about who they are in terms of their material wealth? Is it unusual, the amount of material wealth that you're seeing in those graves?
This is clearly a community that is very well connected and potentially quite wealthy. As well. So they are choosing to bury their dead with a substantial amount of material culture. We tend to see these as small, isolated communities in the early Middle Ages, but actually they were probably part of a much wider network.
Well, they liked nice things, didn't they, quite clearly?
Yes.
Yeah. But at the moment, that is my favourite object of this series of Digging for Britain. It's
Fantastic.
Amazing. As you go back in history, there are very strong links between Scandinavia and Scotland. The Vikings start by attacking places in Britain, Lindisfarne, Iona, but very quickly they're coming here not just to plunder and return home, but to stay. Our next dig takes us to Orkney, where archaeologists are investigating a large Viking settlement. Off the north coast of mainland Scotland sits Rousey, one of the Orkney Islands. It was an important seat of Norse power, and the west of the island is mentioned in the Icelandic Orkneyinga saga, documenting the colonisation of the region by the Viking Sigurd the Mighty. It's home to Scale, an abandoned farmstead with links back to the 17th century. But recently, archaeologists from the University of the Highlands and Islands discovered a long wall running beneath the farm building. The wall is estimated to be over 1,000 years old, which would place it in the Viking era when the Northern Isles came under Norse rule. This year, the team, led by archaeologist Daniel Lee, has returned to the site along with local volunteers. They want to know if this wall could be more than just an ancient boundary. Scale is Norse for hall, and the team think it's possible that this wall could be part of a Viking longhouse or drinking hall. They use their dig diary to document what they find.
We've uncovered more of the wall in Trench 4, and we're extending that trench down to the west. So hopefully we'll be able to find the end of the wall.
Daniel suspects they're excavating one of the long sides of the building. He hopes to find another shorter rear wall at its end.
And we can find the internal area and try and assess what this building was used for. and try and date it more securely.
While half the team gets stuck in trying to find the end of the ancient wall, others working in neighbouring trenches are already finding clues that this was a well-established Norse settlement.
We've got Trench 22, where we found some Norse artefacts and a kind of midney layer. And we had a pig skull and a pot lid and some pottery. Lots of garnet mica schist, which is typically Norse.
Garnet mica schist is a hard rock often used to make millstones, but it's not native to Orkney. The Vikings here most likely imported it from Norway or other parts of Scotland as they spread across the region. But there are also signs that they made ingenious use of the local materials available on this island.
This here's a spindle whorl, quite an exciting find that we've just made in Trench 4, and it's made with the ball joint off the top of a femur. So it's been sawn off, and then it's had a hole bored through it. You can see the ball joint there, and then that would have had a stick through it.
Spindle whorls are weights, often made from soapstone, antler or bone, giving a simple drop spindle the momentum needed to spin fibres into yarn. Despite success in the other trenches, the Viking hall itself is still proving elusive. The mystery wall seems to have no end.
What we got, Jess?
More of the wall that was uncovered last year, and we're hoping to find the corner really soon, but it's not looking promising.
But at the end of week 1, there's a glimmer of hope.
It's day 7 at Scale Farm. We've had a really exciting development in Trench 4. We've got another phase of wall on top of that in the northern side of the trench.
To find a new section of wall built on top of the first implies they're digging the foundations of a structure important enough to have been rebuilt or enlarged. So they start widening the trench.
And we've been trying to expose some of the internal area of what we think is a large building, maybe hoping it would be the hall at scale.
They're now more than halfway through the dig. It's a race against time to find more conclusive evidence. And at last, they have a breakthrough.
Today we've extended the trench further to the south and we think we found it. We've got a very large longhouse, an early longhouse coming out from underneath the settlement mound down the slope to the west towards the shore.
Daniel's suspicions have been confirmed. In another trench they discover a second wall running parallel to the first. Along it they find what looks like evidence for seating, suggesting the structure was indeed a large longhouse.
We've got the inside face of the southern wall running up and down parallel with the trench edge, just there. And we think that this is one of these side benches down the inside face of the long hall that would have run up and down that way, with a similar feature on the opposite side of the hall there. Then you'd have had the hearth somewhere here.
Elsewhere on the site, small personal items are turning up, characteristically Viking in style.
And just found this tiny fragment of really quite finely carved end of a Norse comb, which may have the antler teeth as well. It's got a nice circular design on the end. It's really quite an exciting find. How did it survive from the Norse period in this rubble? How did it get there?
As the days pass, the Great Hall is exposed, and it's even more impressive than Daniel had hoped.
We're looking at probably over 13, possibly 15 plus metres in length. So a really big building, metre-wide walls with internal benches and features starting to come through. So we're really chuffed about that.
A longhouse of this size is a remarkable discovery. Perhaps it could even have been the hall of Sigurd, the first Earl of Orkney himself. It's a reminder of just how strong those Scandinavian connections are here, taking us back to a time when Norse settlers were making this island their home. It's all very well invading a country and establishing a military presence there, but then you have to feed your army. Now, it's quite rare to find any evidence of how the Romans managed to support their troops in Britain. But now archaeologists in northwest Yorkshire are hoping to find some answers. At the northernmost point of the Yorkshire Dales National Park lies the majestic Swaledale. In 2009, a local amateur archaeology group uncovered the footprint of a single roundhouse, a typical Iron Age dwelling. But native Britons continued to make roundhouses right into the Roman period. Archaeologist Philip Barstow has been investigating the site and is returning this year with a team from the University of Newcastle to explore further.
It might be a continuation of this cobble surface that we're seeing.
Philip thinks there could be more dwellings, and he's focusing on an area that they began excavating in 2018.
This is Area 1. Last year, when we opened up the vast open area, we came across these flagstones. So our task this year is to cut into this and try to find the northern edge, because up to now we've only got one definite roundhouse.
As they excavate, the team are finding signs of the people that lived here.
Nice big fat juicy worm, I'll just remove him. And then you can see there, you can see the rim appearing. And the rest of it appears to be here. Oh, it's a lovely massive rim. That's a big pot.
Philip's suspicion that there may be other dwellings here proves to be correct. They've exposed another large cobbled surface with a curved reinforcing wall behind it.
We can confirm this is another roundhouse. It's about 4 or 5 metres in diameter. That's cobbled as well, and cobbled path going up to the west. Amazing. Absolutely amazing structure.
With another roundhouse appearing, this could be a village. But what's most striking is evidence of a sophisticated design feature not usually seen in roundhouses. This carved piece of stone is a door sill.
The work craftsmanship to actually create that lower surface to create an upper ridge there, so the door actually shuts against that.
This unusual masonry seems incongruous. It looks like the work of another group, the Romans.
I've seen no other parallels of this sort of construction in a native Britain site, but loads in Roman forts. So somebody is advising them or showing them or actually making these, and they're putting it in with the context of the house.
There certainly was a strong Roman presence in the area. After the Romans invaded in the 1st century AD, they steadily advanced north, setting up military strongholds along the way. By the mid-2nd century, there were around 50,000 Roman troops in Britain, and some of them were stationed near here.
We've got Bainbridge to the south, we've got Catterick to our east, and to our north we've got Greater Bridge and Bowes. At least 3 of those were in active occupation throughout the whole period.
And these forts needed food.
We've got a pit, flag-based, stones vertical at the sides, well-built, and some sort of possible chute here. Maybe now we've found where they're actually storing their grain. I'm just really pleased with this.
Other finds on the site suggest that not only were the native Britons storing grain here, they were processing it using Roman equipment.
What we're getting back, the information we're getting back is, this is a military type quernstone.
Quernstones like this were used for milling grain into flour.
This is a community living here, using these to grind presumably quite large quantities of grain.
There are also signs that the native Britons were being paid for this work.
And this one's really nice. If you look carefully,
yep,
you can see that she's the wife of Septimus Severus.
Brilliant.
So this coin dates from about 196 to 211.
Right.
And it's a silver denarius. So this is the sort of thing Roman soldiers would have been paid with.
So is that indicating
well, they're buying things on site.
Yeah. They need everything. They need leather, they need animals to eat, they need grain, they need food stuff.
Right.
All of that kind of stuff.
The archaeological evidence is helping us make sense of this intriguing site. It was part of an agricultural landscape within Roman Britain.
Just look down the dale, Upper Swaledale, lovely rich pasture area. The individuals who occupied or owned this were switched on to realise it is essential to 4 Roman forts. We think now this is a well-to-do, well-established, developed farmstead, but they're dealing with the military. You know, their wealth has come with the husbandry of the cattle, the sheep. It could well be the collection point for the whole dale. This is where it comes, this is where it's processed, then off to whichever fort is needed.
And there's still plenty to be discovered.
We need to do the research question where the water's coming from. With all this engineering on site, they can't have been going to the spring to get it in buckets. It must have been ducted on site. And that it will be pivotal to what we do next year.
This site has shown how Roman influence extended into the countryside, where native British farmers could grow rich by supplying food to the Roman military. Many archaeological digs focus on one particular time period, but our next site in Cheshire spans some 10,000 years from the end of the Stone Age through to the 17th century. We sent archaeologist Nisha McSweeney to find out more.
The Poulton Research Project sits just 5 miles south of Chester, close to the Welsh border. This unassuming stretch of farmland may be one of the north of England's most significant archaeological sites of recent times. I'm joining dig leader Dr. Kevin Coots to find out why.
So, Kevin, how did it all get started?
We've got to go back to 1962.
Right.
Mr. Jerry Fair had just taken over the land and he had historic maps of this field. And he could see marked on it an ancient chapel. He could also see the stones just poking out.
Right.
And he found a glazed medieval floor tile of 14th, 15th century date.
Right.
Eventually, the farmer persuaded teams from Cheshire Archeology and Liverpool John Moores University to come and excavate the site.
They knew they were going to find a chapel, but they were hoping it would be a capella ad portam.
Capella ad portam, that sounds like something at the gate.
Yeah, my best Latin, which is not great, but it means it's a chapel at the gate.
Right.
Because we have a lot of ancient literary texts that tell us that there was a missing abbey here, the Abbey of Poulton.
Poulton Abbey was an ancient monastery founded in the 12th century by Cistercian monks. They often had a chapel at the gate so lay people could worship without entering the abbey grounds. The abbey was moved in the early 13th century, but the chapel continued to be used as a local church and cemetery right up until the English Civil War.
It would have been the place where the farmers and their families who actually ploughed the land and worked the land for the monks, that's where they would have worshipped and where they were buried. We didn't expect to find any bones in this graveyard because this is what we call glacial till, or I call the older red boulder clay because everyone knows what it is, and it's generally acidic. But by a sheer geological coincidence, the last great glacier deposited a whole load of crushed calcite in the field, making it neutral. So we have almost perfect preservation of the human remains in this medieval graveyard that we've been training students on for the last 24 years.
This geological anomaly offers an incredible opportunity to study the lives and deaths of one community over hundreds of years. I've joined human remains specialist Ria Carlin to see what she's found in this year's excavations.
What's going on here then? What do we have?
We have an adult skeleton and it's almost complete. So we've got perfect bone preservation here.
Archaeologist's dream.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
Yeah. The burial itself is cutting 2 other features here. So we had a double burial here, juvenile bones in, which itself was cut by a later burial of a teenager in here. So the gravedigger might not have known that there's a burial there. Maybe the wooden cross had disintegrated or they didn't have a burial marker. So,
in terms of dating then, where would we put this in terms of the lifespan of the cemetery?
Probably toward the end, sometime before the Civil War at least.
And by that time, the cemetery's been in use for maybe a couple of 100 years already.
Oh yes, so that would be, the graveyard would be almost full, as you can see by the intercutting features. Yeah. So we just need to take off a little bit of the clay that's still sticking to the bone while it's wet.
Just clean it up a bit here. Okay, so that was just one bone. How long does it take to lift the entire skeleton then at that rate?
It will take us at least the rest of today, maybe a little bit of tomorrow morning as well.
How many have you had on this site to date?
What are we, 986 this one? I think so, 990 I think we are up to now, 990.
That's a lot of excavation, that's a lot of analysis.
It is, isn't it? Absolutely, yeah, it's a big storage room.
Finding the perfectly preserved remains of one community over a 400-year period is fascinating in itself. But what is most incredible about Poulton is that as archaeologists continue to dig down, they realise the site had been occupied for far longer than anyone had previously thought.
What comes before the medieval period then here?
So the medieval grave diggers were actually digging into earlier occupation layers and they were throwing it back in with the medieval burials. So we were getting Roman pottery, we were getting Saxon material, we were even getting material from the first hunter-gatherers to recolonise this area after the retreat of the ice sheets.
Kevin believes he knows why countless generations have kept returning to this location.
We're standing on a site with 10,000 years of human history. Why here in this one place?
Wow, that's a really good question. And the answer is right here in front of us. This is the perfect spot for settlement. That is actually the old Pulford Brook.
Right.
The historic boundary of England and Wales. It's heavily changed now from its original form, but it would have been wider, more free-flowing. You would have been up in this section here, and you would have been looking at the large animals coming down to water. It would have been like shooting fish in a barrel. And it's a floodplain below us. So when the floodwaters recede, it leaves behind very, very nutrient-rich silts, which are really good for agriculture.
And then it moves up through time, through to the extensive Iron Age occupation, into the Roman period, Saxon period, then the medieval period.
Basically, people don't change. People's basic needs stay the same. You need security, you need raw materials, you need water, you need food, you need to survive. So people are always going to inhabit the kind of place where they've got the better chance of survival.
What started as a dig in a small medieval graveyard has become the discovery of a site with 10,000 years of human occupation.
There's this wonderful sense of a community over not just centuries but millennia, and why they're here. And it's not immediately obvious when you come to this place the first time, but then when you start looking around the landscape, it all starts to make a bit more sense.
I've asked Kevin to come in and show me some of the artefacts from this incredible period of occupation at Poulton.
Kevin, this seems like such an extraordinary site with so much time depth, so much going on. And you've got some of the finds here, they're lovely. Yeah. So what's the earliest find you've got on the table here?
This is a beautiful flint that was imported into the region, and it's late Neolithic, early Bronze Age.
That's lovely.
We think it's used for making leather items or possibly other wooden items, and it's absolutely beautiful.
So this is the evidence of the first farmers to move into the
Yes.
region then. And then, moving on, you found some quite spectacular Iron Age remains. I mean, what's this large lump of what looks like rusty metal?
It's called an adze, which is a woodworking tool. You can see the edge of the blade here,
Yeah.
and I'm holding it pretty much upright. There would have been a handle coming through here, and it's used for hafting and working wood.
And then the Romans arrive.
Yep.
So I recognise this as being Roman pottery.
It is indeed. This is a mortarium. It's a food mixing bowl, where the word mortar and pestle come from.
Yeah.
But on the back, somebody has scratched I-V-C-V. And it might mean the name of the owner, Luculla or Lucundus. Basically, this is mine, hands off.
Yeah. So what do you think you've got?
We think we've got, at the moment, a dispersed farmstead. But there is so much material culture, and we have so much to survey, we can't discount anything at the moment. Poulton's a real one-off in this region.
Yeah. And then finally, you've got these beautiful tiles,
They're
which
lovely,
takes you
aren't they?
right back to the original discovery of the site.
Yeah, they're gorgeous. They date to the 14th, 15th century. We've got several designs which are paralleling the local and regional designs themselves.
Yeah.
The medieval chapel floor would have been covered in these.
And When do we see activity ceasing? When's the last date that you've got from this site?
Well, we know it's in ruins by 1681. We think the last time it was used was in the English Civil War, because we have records that Poulton Green was manned by parliamentarian soldiers 3 weeks before the Civil War ended. And we've got material from the actual chapel of that date, including musket shot. We think that they were basically melting down the windows to use the lead. They trashed it. They would have used it as a base. It would have been a great lookout post, a chapel with possibly a tower, but they trashed it.
I think this is absolutely fascinating, and we're getting this wonderful picture of, well, hunter-gatherer communities and then farming communities through the centuries, and this part of the landscape which is quite empty now. It is just farmland, but it's been quite densely populated through time, through all those farming generations, and it's great to see this picture of ordinary life.
This year, the North has once again proven to be a region rich in archaeological discoveries. From forgotten Tudor homes to Anglo-Saxon treasure and a long-lost Viking drinking hall, we've shown there's still so much to do to widen the bounds of our knowledge and shed light on our past. The United Kingdom has an epic history and a wealth of secrets still to uncover. Every year, hundreds of archaeologists dig, dive, and sieve to find clues, to add to the great historical jigsaw of our ancestors' lives.
You know when people say, what's the best thing you've ever found, guys? This.
I'm Professor Alice Roberts.
This year we've uncovered some astonishing finds and made some truly groundbreaking discoveries.
Wow, look at that.
Each team of archaeologists has been armed with a dig diary camera so they can record their discoveries as they happen.
That is brilliant. Dave, I love you.
Our roving archaeologist, Dr. Nisha McSweeney, is out on the digs.
Who are we looking at?
It's royal.
And I'll be inviting the teams to bring in their finds for closer analysis.
That is absolutely beautiful.
This time, we explore Britain's west.
I've come to the edge of Dartmoor, where traces of the ancient past are all around, from castles to rows and circles of Bronze Age standing stones. But in fact, all of the west is rich in archaeology.
Join us to delve into an Ice Age cave.
We have found this beautiful woolly rhinoceros tooth.
Follow up on reported sightings of unexpected human bones.
Across the top of the cliff, we've got human remains eroding out of it.
And bid an emotional farewell to a very long-running site.
It's unique to be able to tell this story of ourselves in one place.
Welcome to Digging for Britain. Our first dig takes us to the Cotswolds, an area with a rich seam of Anglo-Saxon archaeology, and the name itself is thought to relate to an Anglo-Saxon chieftain called Cod and his control of this territory of the High Lands, or Wolds, so Cod's Wolds.
This dig takes us back to around the early 6th century. The exact location has been kept secret to protect it. A team of volunteers led by MOD archaeologist Richard Osgood is following up on the discovery of high-status Anglo-Saxon artefacts in a field.
There's a chap called Chris who's a local metal detector who's got a permission from the farmer to come and have a look at this field. No one knew anything about this field. There was nothing on the historic environment record. He was pretty shocked to find not only a lot of Roman material, but he found two really, really beautiful Saxon items. There was a sword pommel mount from the top of a Saxon blade, which was made of silver gilt, and then a silver buckle as well. So these things are what are called treasure.
Treasure is legally classified as any piece of metal over 300 years old containing over 10% gold or silver, and it has to be reported.
Tell about that. Your thoughts when you got that out of the ground?
I was totally stunned because I knew exactly what it was.
You've not had anything like that before?
No. It's a detector extreme, really, isn't it?
Chris made his finds in 2016 and reported them to Gloucestershire Council. It soon became clear that he'd stumbled on a 6th century Anglo-Saxon burial ground. This prompted a swift call to Richard and his team to formally excavate the site.
So we've got what we believe to be a nice skeleton over here. It's got a nice skull coming through, the cranium coming up in that way, and then we've got the jaw here with the individual teeth just poking through at this point, jawbone just there. As we come down, we've got what is the right arm here, just at the top, just the humerus, and then we come into where the rib section will be once we clean those down.
The finds date to a time when history and material culture show strong links with the Netherlands and Scandinavia. Most Britons at this time are thought to have been pagan, and their burial practices involved interring the dead with plenty of grave goods. And this cemetery is starting to yield some very intriguing finds.
It's a nice, massive, big piece of a rim, like a bowl.
Oh, wow, yeah.
What is it, Janine? Pottery?
Glass.
Glass?
Nice piece of glass.
Just a few days into the dig and they unearth a very rare artefact.
Oh, wow, well done. Oh, that is wonderful.
Beautiful.
You know when people say, what's the best thing you've ever found, guys? This.
The raw material for this bowl may well have come from the Eastern Mediterranean, a major focus for glass production at this time. This exciting archaeological find is unusual, as glass is so fragile, it rarely survives. A bowl like this would have been precious, another indication of high status.
Brilliant.
What really amazes me is that this has been in the ground since the 6th century. It's really, really shallow up there. There's not much topsoil. It's been ploughed for hundreds and hundreds of years. And yes, OK, it's broken, but it's still survived.
Elsewhere on site, the archaeologists are making more extraordinary finds.
Imagine you're holding a sword there, you've got the handle there. That would sit on the handle like that, so that's your guard.
Right.
Wow, that is fantastic.
It looks like a bead.
The Anglo-Saxons are well known for their incredibly intricate jewellery and decorative metalwork.
We're thinking it could be anything from a helmet to a drinking vessel to part of a scabbard. It is indicative of a high-status burial.
It's made of silver, but it's got this gilding in, which is why it looks like gold, and it shines beautifully. After 1,500 years, it's still shiny when you put it in the sun, and that's a really magical item.
In early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, the dead were typically buried fully dressed, with other objects included in the grave that still speak to us of their identity and status.
What have you got now?
We've got a knife. Yeah, I think what we've got, a knife which is just sat over the pelvis area here, but it's just sat on what is the left hip. So probably a dagger, looks too small to be a spear. Yeah, it's certainly all happening here. I think we've got a very, very high status burial with a lot going on.
This unassuming field has proven an extremely rewarding site. Richard has joined me to delve deeper into a couple of the burials which seem to challenge our expectations.
This is photogrammetry of this individual,
burial,
is it?
that's right.
Yeah.
The quality's that good, you can actually see some of the finds in the burial itself. You've got the, you see this circular item just here?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's this.
Ah, is that a spindle whorl?
Yep, that's right. It's really, really nice and tactile, big solid stone spindle whorl. And then just further up,
Yeah.
that's this thing.
Ah, what's that? It looks like a toggle.
Yeah, it's an antler, well, we call it an antler prong, but it's something we think probably used within textile working. It's got a suspension loop
Yeah.
for wearing just around your neck as part of the weaving process.
And then what about those? They're beautiful. Are they beads?
These are polished pieces of amethyst. And you can see they've also been pierced all the way through the middle for incorporation in jewellery.
These are objects that you would associate with an Anglo-Saxon woman, but I'm a bit dubious, actually, whether this is a woman that we're looking at. So the first thing is that the bones are quite robust. There's chunky areas of muscle attachment, and then the pelvis. It's frustrating that it's so fragmentary, but we are getting the very top of that greater sciatic notch at the back of the pelvis. I'm saying kind of probable male with that. This is what's really interesting, is the jaw, because that's an incredibly prominent chin. And then on the other side, we've got the angle of the jaw, which is flared out. That tends to push me more in this direction of this being a male skeleton.
That's right. So, yeah, so the sort of drinking vessels, swords, shields, spears, things that give you this real kind of macho and machismo feel. Yes, you expect them to be potentially male burials. But this one, if it's a male burial with female grave goods, really does sort of tip that on its head.
And this is the other burial that we saw quite clearly in your film that I was really intrigued by, and particularly that. Can I pick it up?
Yeah, if you do it very carefully, yeah.
That's really light. It's so thin and fine, isn't it?
We're wondering whether that is a Saxon dish or bowl, or in fact maybe a Roman piece of glass as an heirloom.
Really? Wow. What's this here? This is an iron object, isn't it?
That's the knife that we were excavating, and it looked really good in the ground, all intact, but it was held together by the soil. So
Yeah.
that is the knife, and it had a leather belt which had little bronze studs and fittings that went with it around the waist of the individual.
So this is what's astonishing about these Saxon graves, is you're looking at somebody who's buried fully clothed, and then with lots of other items around them which speak about their identity and their status.
So yeah, all the attributes of a warrior burial: sword, shield, spear, and all this extra equipment.
And then what's amazing about that is that this is a warrior burial. The individual in it was about 10 years old. So there's the top of the shin bone. And in fact, the very top of it is still completely separate. And then eventually, when it reaches its full length, it will fuse and these two bits of bone come together. So yeah, a growing individual. We're seeing exactly the same when we look at the teeth. These are the milk teeth. So those are the two baby molars, and they're about to be knocked out very soon by the premolars, so those two cusped teeth. You have to do all this objective archaeological science, but you can't help thinking about the people that laid that little body to rest.
When you're excavating, you are the first people to see this, since those that are grieving are putting them into the ground, and it's impossible not to project your own feelings and emotions into this.
An amazing pair of burials that tell us interesting things about identity in this period, but will yield up more secrets as we apply more science. The Saxons were originally pagan, but then they converted to Christianity, and they built the first monasteries in Britain. In Shaftesbury, Alfred the Great founded an abbey with a nunnery alongside it, with his daughter Ethelgafu as the abbess. Archaeologist Nisha McSweeney went along to see the excavations at the site.
The market town of Shaftesbury dominates the landscape of Dorset. It was once the home of Shaftesbury Abbey, the first nunnery in Britain that became one of the most powerful and prominent in the land. But the abbey, like so many during the 16th century English Reformation, was plundered and destroyed by command of Henry VIII. I've come along to help archaeologist Julian Richards look for any remnants of this important historic site.
We're trying to find out whether what's laid out here is the actual truth.
Most of what Julian knows about the abbey is from the findings of the last big excavations completed back in the 1930s. Following these, a plan was drawn up, mapping what was thought to be the footprint of the original abbey. Julian has pored over these plans, but for him, something just doesn't add up.
This is a site that has been dug before, you said, in the 1930s.
Yeah.
What made you come back to it now? Yeah.
We want to see just what survived and whether we believed elements of this plan. Because just simply from an architectural and engineering point of view, You look at some elements of it and you think, I don't believe that. That's not in the right place.
The original Saxon abbey was rebuilt through the 11th and 12th centuries, and subsequent modifications included a rich refurbishment in the 14th century. The cloister of the abbey was supposedly on the southern front, commanding the view from the top of the hill. But Julian suspects it was never there.
Now, this is where the cloister wall's supposed to be, but when we excavated it, we found absolutely nothing.
The cloister is the beating heart of an abbey, not just a place of contemplation and prayer, but the structure around which an abbey's principal buildings were arranged. Back in 1954, historian Laura Sydenham created architectural drawings for her extensive study of the abbey. But these drawings were based on the 1930s excavation, speculating where the cloister may have been. Locating the whereabouts of the cloister is critical to establishing where the rest of the abbey lay.
So the last thing we're doing is a couple of slots across the line of the cloister wall to try and see if that cloister exists on the southern side. So, well, come on, I'll show you what we're doing.
Fab, thank you.
Unearthing the foundations of the lost abbey has proved a challenge in itself. There's a modern rockery garden which needs dismantling for the team to dig beneath.
So this is our next little problem, is removing a half-ton block of stone. Well, it's the end of the first week of digging, and it's been very hot, and we've moved enormous quantities of soil. But we're starting to get to grips, I think, with the layout of the abbey and what survives underneath these remains that were laid out in the 1930s. I think this is potentially where the wall is.
It's not looking promising. As we dig, Julian's becoming increasingly puzzled.
Have you found a wall?
What does it look like?
It doesn't look like a wall to me. Bizarrely, it basically looks like a shallow ditch. So we've got no wall here, no wall there. 3 metres beyond that, we have got a wall. But this isn't the continuous structure that we were expecting to find here, marking the edge of the cloister. It's just a ditch. I'm trying to dig another trench over there.
Julian's suspicions about the plans are becoming more compelling. The trenches they've dug are not giving him the answers he's looking for, so he decides to expand his initial dig outline. In pursuit of the cloister, the team have come across some telling features along the way.
So these cracked and worn tiles are part of the 14th century floor of this part of the church, worn by the feet of hundreds, thousands of people who've walked over them. And also you can see here, they dip down. This is because they're sinking into a grave that runs in this direction, because this part of the church will be where important people were buried.
The abbey, profiting from royal patronage as well as being the site of St Edward's Shrine, became very prosperous. Over the centuries, it acquired huge estates in the surrounding area. It was said that if the Abbess of Shaftesbury married the Abbot of Glastonbury, they would be richer than the king himself. This made it a prime target during the dissolution of the monasteries. And in 1539, on the order of Henry VIII, the last abbess signed the deed of surrender. The lands were sold off, and this great symbol of Roman Catholic power was demolished. Julian's keen to show me the spot where just the week before there was a surprise find that paints a vivid picture of the abbey's tragic demise.
The end of the abbey. What evidence have you got for what happened here on the ground?
Well, I mean, this is the bit really that I suppose gives you a very graphic idea of what happened, because this is where one of the massive pillars stood that supported the central crossing tower. But they've taken out every last bit of usable stone. But what amazes me is that what came out of that in this corner, they didn't want that.
Who are we looking at?
We don't know who it is. We can't work out which
Male,
king or
female,
queen.
king
Well, we
or
don't even work out because the hairstyles are very similar.
Yeah.
It was an amazingly exciting find, you know, not just from the point of view of it being a beautiful object, but it does tell us something about how this part of the church, which was the junction between the nuns' private part of the church and the more public part, looked like.
This excavation at first opened up, you know, this year, and they thought they knew what they were doing. They were just confirming a few things, and actually, what's been really interesting to see it, kind of, actually our expectations being confounded and the whole kind of thing being blown wide open. We thought we knew where this giant church was. We thought we knew where the cloister was. Because of the kind of huge scale of the demolition that went on with the dissolution of the monasteries. I mean, this entire complex was just completely flattened, almost nothing left of it. That's quite a sobering thought too, in terms of what that would have meant for the wider community, and the kind of they were economically dependent, they were socially dependent on this place, and it just kind of makes you think about the wider social effects of this change.
Despite digging all summer and discovering large sections of the abbey, the puzzle over the cloister is yet to be solved.
Julian, tell me about this site that you've been digging. What was the big mystery?
Our efforts at the moment have been concentrated on excavating in the Abbey Church.
So the Abbey Church, I think this is drone
you...
footage that you've taken this summer.
Yes, so this is the area. In fact, you can see our excavation trenches here. But we've always had slight doubts about elements of it because it just doesn't seem quite right. And I've always felt that there's an element of imagination in this.
Right.
Like there really isn't room enough for a southern cloister before you go off the edge of the slope.
So do you think those cloisters are entirely imagined then?
I'm beginning to think that there isn't a cloister on the south of it at all.
Yeah.
I think it's probably on the north.
And what about the finds? You've brought some wonderful things in.
Yes, I mean, we found some amazingly fresh-looking tiles. Beautiful little things, but still with all their glaze on them, which implies that whatever was there wasn't being walked on much. So, you know, the tiles tell a story, but then this one, it's absolutely fantastic, isn't it? This was just in the demolition period rubble. So 1539, they start smashing the place up. And clearly, this, if you look at it, it's three-dimensional. It's got a back to it. It's not a tomb figure. It's a standing statue.
Yeah.
And it's royal as well, because you've got a crown, and also, look, these are representing jewels on the crown. We think it's male. It looks a bit like some statues of Edward II, but we need to research this a bit more.
Yeah.
So that was a fantastic find.
And what about this lovely bead?
Well, one of our volunteers was digging and said, I found a plastic bead. And I said, no, you haven't, because you're digging a medieval deposit.
So is this jet?
It's jet, but it's such a big bead. If it was part of a rosary, to me, the story that, you know, that object might be able to tell, you know, was this a nun being ejected from there, you know, her rosary broke, because this obviously just sort of fell into a corner and then has ended up in the rubble. But, you know, to me, it's the story that an object like that could tell, you know, if only it could talk.
As we go right back into prehistory, archaeological evidence can become very thin on the ground. And that's because our prehistoric ancestors were nomadic hunter-gatherers. They just didn't settle in one place for very long at all. Our next dig comes from a site in North Wales which contains precious, tantalising glimpses of very early modern humans in Britain. Hidden away in a ravine east of the Vale of Clwyd lies the entrance to Ffynnon Bino Cave. The first excavations here were carried out by the Geologists Association back in the 1880s. They found stone tools and plenty of ancient animal bones. Over the decades, this site has attracted a lot of archaeological attention. This year, Dr. Rob Dinnis and a team from the University of Edinburgh are investigating the cave, and they're filming a dig diary along the way.
This is the first week we've opened up the trenches now, so we're starting to work in earnest. And the cave's up there, so let's take a wander up and see.
There are 2 trenches, one inside the cave and one just outside.
What we're digging here is a spoil heap. So that is material that's come from inside the cave that's been redeposited out the front as part of earlier excavations in the 1880s.
Some of the earlier finds in the cave take us right back to a time when Neanderthals were living in Britain. The Victorian dig found these beautiful flint spear points, characteristic of late Northern European Neanderthals. Another find was a type of stone tool thought to have been made by early modern humans around 35,000 years ago. It's thought there was a hiatus between Neanderthals and modern humans in Britain that spanned several millennia. As well as evidence of early humans, that first dig also turned up animal bones of 16 different species, including cave lion and mammoth.
The reason why we're digging this is to look for material that was missed in those earlier excavations. And that appears to be the case. We've already found some bits of Ice Age animal bones, some animal teeth, as well as some small bits of stone tools.
The team is looking in the spoil heap outside the cave for good reason. Early excavations often missed key finds. Back in 2014, a human tooth was found in the spoil. It was radiocarbon dated to around 2300 BC during the late Neolithic. Inside the cave, Rob is digging down through the muddy sediment on the floor, hoping to find untouched layers.
Most of the Ice Age sediments were actually removed during the dig in the 1880s, but we have been doing some work and we found quite a lot of intact sediments that contain Ice Age animal bones. We found a bank of intact sediments that contain rhino, contain hyena, contain intact Ice Age material, and fingers crossed we'll be able to find some archaeological material in there.
As well as Neanderthals and early modern humans, the archaeologists are searching for evidence as to who else may have used the cave. They've previously found a coprolite, or fossilised faeces, belonging to a hyena thought to be at least 35,000 years old. The 19th century researchers also found coprolites and noted a number of gnawed bones. They concluded that hyenas must have been living in the cave as a den and were probably responsible for bringing the bulk of the animal bones into it. The team continued to dig down into the untouched sediments.
Here we are in the pit, having a wonderful time. We are down to intact cave earth here, intact deposit. We have found this beautiful woolly rhinoceros tooth. Woolly rhinoceros went extinct in Britain 35,000 years ago, so this means that we are in deposit that is at least that old, which is significant because around that time is when we think there were last Neanderthals and the earliest modern humans in Britain. So we're in the right time period, on track, potentially for finding archaeology.
The assemblage from this cave is incredibly rare. In fact, Funanbino Cave is only one of 3 places in Britain to have evidence of both late Neanderthal and early modern humans in the same site. It appears that this cave still contains a rich seam of archaeology. Its secrets will keep archaeologists like Rob and his team coming back here for many years into the future.
Most archaeological excavations tend to take place over a single block of time, particularly if they're related to construction and development. University excavations, on the other hand, usually take place over just a few weeks in the summer, but the archaeologists will keep coming back if there's plenty to find. One such dig near Bristol has turned into a real labour of love. It's been going on for well over a decade and is now just coming to a close. Just north of Bristol, close to the mouth of the Severn Estuary, sits beautiful Berkeley Castle. It's the oldest building in England, still inhabited by the same family, whose ancestors began building it in the 11th century.
In 2010, Digging for Britain was on site with Bristol University archaeologists who wanted to understand what was happening here before the castle was built. This year, we returned to Berkeley with Professor Mark Horton and Dr. Stuart Pryor, who are searching for more evidence of the origins of this site.
It's unique to be able to tell this story of ourselves in one place, and here in Berkeley encapsulates that idea.
When they first started their dig, they suspected the site had been home to an 8th century Saxon minster. But the scale of the monastic settlement proved much greater than they imagined. The amount of archaeology exceeded expectations and has brought them back year after year to explore the minster buildings and boundaries.
So this is the famous Berkeley excavation, and it is a veritable slice through history. But the real interest of Berkeley is the period before the conquest. This is the time in which Berkeley was a minster or a monastery. We found huge quantities of material associated with this Anglo-Saxon monastery.
A minster is an important church often accompanied by a collection of monastic buildings. A place of prayer, but also a place to live and work for monks and nuns. Over the years, 8 trenches have been dug around the estate to assess the scale of the monastery. The team are currently digging in a paddock to the north of the castle. According to records, the Saxon minster here was demolished in 1043. After the Norman conquest, the stone was used to build later structures in Berkeley, including part of the existing church and castle. As well as the monastery, the team have unearthed multiple layers of history.
We've got at least 1,000 years of history in one trench. Starting at the top, we had 17th and 18th century garden features. Below that, we had burials from the 17th century. Below that, we had an English Civil War ditch. Underneath that, we found Anglo-Saxon structures, and that's the most important find for us.
One exceptionally rare piece found at Berkeley is this exquisite gold ring, a fine example of just how skilled the Anglo-Saxons were with intricate metalwork. But the team has found evidence of human activity even earlier than the Saxons. They haven't found buildings, but there are definite traces of Roman activity.
We found a Roman roadway cutting across here, and this very curious ditch-like feature. And in the fill of that, we found a piece of broken up silver, a great big piece of what we call hack silver. Now that's what the Romans paid their barbarian mercenaries to defend their villa estates, literally chopping up the family silver. And maybe what we've actually got is a little bit of family silver that one of those mercenaries dropped and just left it there in the ditch.
The Berkeley project has been an emotional rollercoaster of a journey, both on and off-site. For Stuart, there was a time when he thought he wouldn't even live to see the dig through.
I had a serious brain injury 3 years ago.
Following an illness, Stuart's prognosis was dire.
They thought I was going to die. If I did survive, they thought I'd be hospitalised for the rest of my life.
But Stuart fought hard, despite the seemingly impossible physical challenges, and against all the odds, he was determined to get back out into the field, to return to the job he loved and the dig at Berkeley.
Fortunately for me, I'm a bit of a fighter and I wasn't going to give up. Basically fought my way back from being on the deathbed to being back at work again.
At the end of the dig, with heavy hearts, they've made the difficult decision to call it a day.
Why it's ending, I'm retiring from Bristol University, and you've got to draw a line somewhere, and kind of that's the end of an era.
In its closing year, the dig here has not disappointed. A find late in the day provides yet more evidence of the lost Berkeley Minster.
So perhaps our most important find this season is this ditch. It's not a defensive arrangement, it's a boundary ditch. It was a way of delimiting the edge of the Anglo-Saxon monastery. And we know it's Anglo-Saxon because actually just last night this came out, and it's part of an Anglo-Saxon buckle. And what's remarkable, it's still got traces of the gilding. We haven't cleaned it up yet. We're pretty happy that this is evidence of, what one of those high-status nuns would have been wearing in the 8th and early 9th centuries.
Since 2005, this project has delivered year after year. But now, it's time to say goodbye.
I will be sad to leave Berkeley. A part of me will always remain at Berkeley because I've loved my time working here.
So tell me what you've found then. Summarise this kind of 15 years of digging.
So essentially, we were looking to prove that there was actually a minster at Berkeley because nobody even knew just when we started that there was actually the minster at Berkeley.
What do the finds tell you, and why do they make you think that this was actually a minster?
So we've got evidence for probably maybe a scriptorium. So if you were a king and you wanted to get any writing done, you would go to a monastery or a nunnery and get your Anglo-Saxon documents drawn up. And so we've got evidence for that in the finds. So we've got this lovely little thing here, which is the astle.
So an astle is a pointer for, well, keeping your place in a book, isn't it?
That's right. You can see there's a little Celtic cross in there.
So here it would have attached onto a bone pin.
Yeah. And then when you get to the end of your page, you use the little round bit to turn over your medieval vellum parchment or the page.
So that's a beautiful object in its own right, but it's telling us something really important about Berkeley. It's telling us that there were people reading and writing.
Reading and writing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a long-standing, powerful religious community.
What kept you going back?
We just didn't get to the end of all the... I mean, you keep going down and keep going down until you run out of archaeology. And we haven't. We've got pottery, we've got metal artefacts, we've got all sorts of things that are Roman in origin. We've got a tiny little scalpel.
Oh, yeah, can I have a look?
Yeah.
So would that have been used surgically, do you think?
I think surgically, or at least in some sort of bathroom kit. So if you're chopping up your makeup and that sort of thing, or herbs and spices.
Lovely. Yeah. And what about that pin? Is that
I think that's almost certainly a clothes pin. But you can see under the camera there.
Oh, the head of that is really ornate.
But yeah, it's for holding your clothing together before buttons were invented. And then you've got strap ends. Yeah.
Come look at that one.
That's one of my favourite finds. It's like a little dragon's head. You can just see where the strap would have fitted.
That's amazing. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The Anglo-Saxons did love hiding little animals and faces and things.
That's it, yeah. And then next is one of my favourite finds, which my students gave the name of the Berkeley gnome. And if you put it under the camera, you can see it's a little face.
It does look like a gnome.
Yeah. So imagine imagine a crossguard on a dagger.
Yeah.
Yeah. On either end of it, you've got one of those little terminals.
Right.
Yeah.
And we've got an arrowhead.
Yeah, that's almost certainly 15th century, I think. Imagine being shot from the castle walls from one of those.
So you've got find specialists.
Yes, they're
looking
at the moment,
at all of these now, poring over them,
that's
trying
it,
to work out what they all are.
We've got 15 years of research findings trying to work out exactly what they all are.
Yeah.
For our final report. And
then
it brings us right up to our 1980s builder's Casio watch, or gardener's Casio watch.
A very precious archaeological item, that, Stuart.
Well, we do total collection, so our students pick up everything they find, So if it's in the trench and it's buried, it's a find.
Yeah, it was in the ground.
It was in the ground, and somebody lost their digital watch, and one of my students found it.
Very beautiful thing, Stuart.
Well, in 200 years' time, I'd have never seen one before.
Yeah.
And they're mystified as to what it was, yeah?
They'll be able to get it out of the collection at Berkeley Castle.
That's it, yeah, absolutely.
It can be very difficult to come up with names for groups of people in prehistory. We have absolutely no idea what they called themselves. So often we look at their culture, at the objects they made,
and use that as a label for them. On our next dig, we're joining MOD archaeologist Richard Osgood and his team of ex-military personnel in Wiltshire, and they're excavating a Bronze Age burial mound of a type that is linked to the mysterious Beaker people. This burial mound lies just 5 miles from Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain and is known as Barrow Clump.
We're now at the site of the last of the protected burial mounds at this part of Salisbury Plain. What I'm hoping to find in this trench is anything that it is put into it that will relate to the early Bronze Age. This site never fails to deliver. Each year, there's been one really incredible story that's emerged. I'm really optimistic that we might, in this instance, be privileged enough to see a Beaker grave.
This type of burial mound is typical of the early Bronze Age, around 2000 BC. This is the time when the last stones of nearby Stonehenge were set in place. Although there's still so much about Stonehenge that mystifies us to this day, we know it was built in stages, from the Neolithic through to the early Bronze Age, the time of the Beaker people.
The Beaker people, it's a name that's been given because the burials are of a particular type. They are usually accompanied with a pot, the eponymous beaker. It's a little drinking vessel that's found in the grave with them, sometimes with other grave goods as well.
Most of our knowledge of these Bronze Age people comes from their graves, which often contain these distinctive beakers. Particular styles of vessels help with dating and show how traditions spread. The earliest known bell-shaped beaker pottery comes from Portugal and Spain, but then the style spreads north. Within 100 years, these beakers appear in Britain. 2 beaker burials have previously been found at Barrow Clump, but Richard thinks there may be more. And it's not long before the team starts to uncover human remains.
Well, the jumble of bones is a jumble of bones, but it appears quite likely that this jumble of bones is a secondary feature.
Beaker burials are typically found under the centre of a mound, often surrounded by a large ring ditch. This would have been dug out by hand using tools such as antler picks and cow shoulder blade shovels, tools often found left behind in the ditches. Some mounds would be reused for secondary burials. These bones are most likely to be from a later time, not a beaker burial, as they're so shallow.
That's the trouble with it, because ordinarily, if you're just dealing with a single skeleton, or even a couple of skeletons, you know what's attached to what, so you know what you're going to expect when you're cleaning them up. With this being a total jumble, you've just got to be very careful, because you don't know exactly what you're going to find.
As they dig deeper into the mound, the team find a barbed and tanged flint, typical of the Bronze Age.
It's a rough out for an arrowhead, so it's not complete. Somebody's started work on it, and they decided not to go any further with it. It's a really nice find, and it's definitely Bronze Age.
Barrow Clump is officially protected as a scheduled monument. Despite this, it's also today part of an agricultural landscape and an area of intensive military training.
There's loads of things that could threaten archaeology on a military training area. A tank is 60 tonnes, it's a really, really heavy thing. That driving over a burial mound could potentially do a lot of damage. So what we're looking at here is just evaluating precisely how damaging those entities are.
Measures have been put in place to remind the army of the important heritage here, but there are some local residents who are harder to control.
We put signs up just to make it extra clear. Big spade, sign saying no digging. What it doesn't do is tell badgers how to read. The really big problems are burrowing animals. And over the years, we've been finding a lot of archaeology that's been brought out from the badger sets.
Meanwhile, the team has worked their way down to what they believe is the centre of the burial mound.
They've just come across a set of human remains. I can see from here the femur and the pelvis of an individual. Bones look in really good condition. So we're really excited because you've got what we've been looking for the whole 3 weeks in one small hole in this barrow.
Archaeologist Dorothy Griffiths was first to find the bones.
Truth be told, I was about to give up because we kept seeing so much flint and so many rocks. I haven't had a chance to make a snapshot to send and boast to my friends back in America and those in Jamaica. So I'll be excited. Having not done archaeology for over 17 years, I am, as I said, overjoyed.
As the rest of the remains are revealed, the team are confident that this is a beaker burial. But they have yet to find an actual beaker.
The real hope is that there's going to be a beaker at one end. That would be the real triumph of this dig.
Now the dig is finished, the finds, including the bones, have been carefully packaged up and taken off-site. And our roving archaeologist, Nisha McSweeney, has been along to the labs at WWII Archeology to find out more.
At the Wessex Post excavation, I'm hoping project manager Phil Andrews has been able to establish whether it was a beaker burial they found.
Is this beaker from the burial?
This unfortunately isn't. This was found probably about a couple of 100 metres away, but the burial we had didn't have a vessel. In fact, it didn't have any grave goods with it.
And do we need to have a beaker for it to be a beaker period burial?
We don't, but we know from other evidence, particularly the size of the graves, which are very substantial chambered graves with timber linings, of evidence for timber lining, that they are of that period. We're very certain that it is a beaker burial, and we will confirm this through radiocarbon dating in due course.
I'm curious to know what Phil has found out about the impact of the military presence at Barrow Clump.
We're investigating the site. We've been looking at the impact of military vehicles passing over some of the remains. And this is a classic example of the weight of vehicles has just crushed what may have once been a complete vessel. Overall, the damage being caused by vehicles is very slight. Certainly the damage from badgers is clearly much more significant, but military vehicles, they're not causing a significant impact at all, which is good news.
It's great news for the archaeology then. Badgers are worse than tanks.
Tanks, yeah.
Senior osteoarchaeologist Kirsten Egging-Dinwiddie is examining the remains for the first time.
So we've got a little bit of the skull there.
What bit of the skull is that?
If I hold it like that.
Is it?
Not quite.
No.
It's actually this bit here.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. That's quite chunky. I mean, mine.
Yeah.
If I feel mine's very small, whereas it's quite
serious cheekbones.
Yeah. So, which is,
are we thinking he?
I'm thinking he. The
Right,
the size of this individual and some of the traits and things on the skull. If we look at some of the other bones. The size of the head of the humerus there, that's quite large. So I'm pretty happy with this being a male.
What's exciting about post-excavation is what it can reveal. The age, the sex, so much more about who this person was.
So that's really nice, strong muscle attachments there. Not massively long, so not necessarily a very, hugely tall person, but certainly quite robust. And again, these slightly strange muscle attachments there. An anchoring point for your muscles and attachments.
Bigger muscles need bigger anchoring points.
Yeah.
What about the age then?
Okay, so we've got the ends of the bones are completely fused on. Not only is it fused, it's started to get these osteophytes, these bony growths at the edges, which is a sign of wear and tear.
It's not just an adult then, it's an adult who's then lived longer and seen wear and
Yes,
tear.
certainly into the 40s, possibly up to mid-50s.
So does Kirsten think the environment at Barrow Clump is causing any damage to these bones?
You can see that's quite eroded. You've lost most of the surface there.
What would have done that?
Could be water flowing through the grave. There are many, many things that affect the burial environment. Even putting fertiliser on the soil, that can leach in and change the chemical makeup of the soil and the burial environment, which may adversely affect the bone.
Meeting Phil and Kirsten today has given me a real insight into the research that is being done into the preservation on this site. And it seems as though their findings are positive.
Military vehicles, tanks rolling over these graves. Actually, it's been really good to see that that's not so much of a problem. That actually, it's funny, it's the badgers, it's the soil chemistry and those more natural things. So that's quite good to know.
Our next dig takes us to the coast of South Wales, where strange things are afoot, quite literally in this case. Around 20 miles west of Cardiff, along the coast near the village of Monknash, there's a cliff proving to be a cause for concern. After public reaction to what appeared to be human bones sticking out of the cliff face, the police were called in to investigate. The bones were identified as archaeological remains, and Professor Jackie Mulville from Cardiff University was drafted in to help.
In this case, this is what we call rescue archaeology. We get reports from the public, and obviously people are slightly concerned at the idea that you can see bits of legs eroding out.
Previously rescued bones from this site have been dated to the 15th century, during the early Tudor period. On this occasion, there's been a report of a skeleton in urgent need of attention. It sits right next to the coastal footpath, a popular walk for the general public.
A bit of human bone here, this sort of flat section here, and there's a human bone here, which you can't, it's very hard to see.
As the excavation progresses, it's clear the lower part of the skeleton is missing.
Half the pelvis has gone, so we don't actually have it with us today, and the bit we've got left probably isn't as diagnostic as it should be.
With storm swells from the Atlantic often battering the coastline, the cliff face is eroding backwards. Coastal officer Paul Huckfield works closely with the police and Cardiff University. He's very familiar with this stretch of coast.
Across the top of the cliff, as you can see now, we've got 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 grave cuts with human remains eroding out of it. Over time, as the cliffs have eroded, more and more burials have just been exposed by natural erosion of the cliff face as it moves backwards.
The team know that the cliff is full of bones and eventually plan to excavate the other visible remains. But for the moment, their focus has to be on the ones they can reach. Jackie hopes these will divulge more of the wider story.
We'll be able to work out more accurately who they were, what age they were, what sex they were, and bits about their life histories. And by reuniting them and then reinterring them, we're actually treating them, I suppose, in a much better way than them sort of falling piecemeal out the cliff.
As the team dig on, there's an unanticipated twist.
So far we have the elbow joint right here, the humerus pointing that way, which is the opposite way to what we'd expect it, given that the legs are down there. And then you have the ulna, so that's the lower arm, coming this way. So we think maybe something, the hands behind the head. So we're all a bit perplexed.
Jackie's unsure why the body is contorted in the way it is.
The burial has thrown up a few surprises. What we appear to have here is somebody who's been buried in a slightly sort of haphazard manner, and this suggests that possibly they were buried in a hurry or by somebody who didn't actually care. It could be that they're actually compressed in a grave that's too small because the person didn't have time, or perhaps didn't want to make the investment to make a grave that was the right size for them. So it is unusual.
The coastal location and unorthodox positioning of the bodies has given rise to a number of theories as to who these people might be. One theory suggests they could have been victims of shipwrecks, and local legends tell of wreckers. These people would put lights around the necks of sheep, walking them along the cliff top to lure ships onto the rocks. For centuries, wrecking ships to loot cargo was a very profitable activity. Over the course of the day, the archaeologists begin to reveal the rest of the skeleton.
We're making really good progress. We can now see most of the head. We've got the mandible exposed. You can also see sort of the ribs, the pelvis and the lower back. So we can see we've got the full torso of an individual who's sort of slightly twisted.
Just before the bones are lifted for further examination, the team gather some final evidence.
By taking a number of images, we can stitch them together using a photographic program, and then that will allow us to actually have an accurate record of the articulation of the bones when we get back to the lab.
These burials seem to be part of an unknown graveyard, or at least there are no marked graves up on the top of the cliff.
No, so there's no marked graves, but people have been found for decades, really, so
Okay.
since the 1980s. And some of the graves are aligned. There's even some graves which have sort of disarticulated human remains and that are a little bit further back from the cliff. So we're kind of like, well, who are they? Why are they there?
And you've got a lovely 3D photogrammetry of the skeleton as you were excavating it.
Yeah. What you've got is somebody whose arms appear to be above their head, and then their head is turned sort of to one side. So the other burials that have been found further along the cliff, they're all interred with their hands sort of down their sides. So this is an anomaly.
Right, OK.
OK.
And then we're missing the
Yes.
entire bottom half of this individual. Presumably that has just eroded out of the cliff.
Well, we know it was there because a member of the public sent in a photo, and you could see sort of, the bottom of the legs.
Yeah. Ethically, you kind of want to reassemble them,
you
don't
do, you know.
So you think this is a young individual, isn't it?
Yeah.
The top of the humerus here, the epiphysis, is completely unfused. So that was still growing. And then if I look at the teeth, the first molar is through. That comes through on average age 6. Second molar comes through around 12. And I can see down in there the wisdom teeth still nestled in their crypts. So you are probably looking at somebody who is a young teenager.
Yeah, but around that time, young teenagers, you could be treated as an adult, really. You would be in employment around that time.
Yeah, it is tricky, isn't it? Because with young men or boys, they haven't developed the kind of robusticity of the skull that we see later on. But that is quite a squared off chin. But this is quite a
sort of
feminine
smooth.
face.
Nice smooth.
With the forehead coming down to the nose there.
We think it's a teenage boy who's been inserted rather strangely in a grave. He's at a different level to all of the others.
Yeah.
The others are all male. So who are they? And why are they all male? So obviously there's some fantastic stories about smugglers and pirates and things. And in fact, there's a fantastic story that the pub, which is actually now built as part of the sort of monastic grange, used to be a mortuary for shipwrecked sailors.
Really?
Yes. And we know there were shipwrecks around that point. Whether they were caused by the wreckers or whether they were just natural shipwrecks, we don't know. And, I mean, there's quite a lot of, I suppose, accounts of shipwrecked people not being buried in consecrated ground, but actually being buried quite close to the edge quite close to where they're found by the sea.
It's tricky because it's all kind of circumstantial evidence at the moment, isn't it?
It is.
We know there were shipwrecks there. We've got this intriguing story about the pub being a mortuary.
Yeah.
So what about further analyses on this skeleton? What are you going to try?
So we're going to try and find out sort of where they lived and sort of what they ate, really. Essentially, the more sort of analyses you do, the more sort of a complex picture you build up of somebody's life.
Yeah.
So you don't know. I mean, Britain's an island full of rich archaeology. We will continue to find more and more coastal archaeology because of climate change, storminess, and all of those things. So it's important that we have good mechanisms and we get the public on side, actually. Because, I always think that there's these sort of lost souls.
Yeah.
We should be sort of bringing them all back together.
And if anyone does know where his legs are,
yes, please.
bring them to Cardiff University.
Please bring them back.
Yeah.